This is Dennis Bernstein, and this is for the National Satellite Broadcast on the Collapse of Banking, SNLs. All right, Pete Brewton, thank you for joining us on this radio special. You are the author of a new book, The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush. Should be released very shortly on Shapolsky, actually. It will have been released by the time this radio broadcast airs. Over a period of several years at the Houston Post, you wrote a multi-part series that began to unfold the relationship between the CIA, organized crime, and federally insured SNLs and banking institutions. In your investigation, you began to link powerful U.S. officials, Houston-based officials, officials around the country, some members of the corporate elite in this country, to illegal activities that were related to organized crime activities and so on and so forth, and CIA covert actions, some illegal covert actions that were carried out under the guise of national security. Your new book, The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush, picks up essentially where the Houston Post articles dropped off, or enhances on some of them and then takes them further. And I want to start there with you on where you left off on that investigation. And I want to have you talk a little bit about some of the key people that you mentioned. We're talking about some very powerful people, and the title of your book is George Bush. He is now, as people know, the President of the United States. He's currently running for a second term. In your book, people like James Baker are mentioned, involved in some pretty serious activities, if what you say and have documented is true. You talk about perhaps names that people wouldn't know, but are very powerful people in Houston and around the country. People like Walter Mischer. And we were going to talk a lot about Walter Mischel because he plays a central role in your book and some of the activities that we've described. But before we do that, I think for the people who are just coming into the story now, I'd like you to give an overview on exactly what it is that you wrote about. What is the macro picture? What is the story you tell without the names before we get into the specifics?
We were just trying to figure out one $100 million deal at a failed savings loan in Houston has gone bad. And we were just trying to find out how much money was involved and how much money the savings loan lost and where the money went. And all of a sudden we're running into incredible brick walls. We can't find out who was involved. We can't find out how much money the savings loan lent. We can't find out where the money went. Everybody's stonewalling. The FBI didn't know what was going on. Federal regulators didn't know what was going on. Nobody would talk to us. Finally, when we talked to the chairman of the board of this savings loan, which was Mainland Savings, which failed in April of '86, at the time it failed, it was the largest failed S&L in the country. It had $1 billion in assets. And Raymond Hill, in our conversation, our interview with him, would not tell us what was going on and tried to give us some nonsense stuff about why a savings loan failed and what was going on with the industry.
And he was the CEO of that.
Yeah, so he was the chairman of the board and the CEO. And we kept trying to push him to answer our questions. This $100 million deal involved some apartment syndicators from New York City. We thought that was kind of strange that they would be down in Texas dealing with a medium-sized savings and loan. And Hill would not answer our questions and eventually became quite belligerent and arrogant. And in fact, in all my dealings with people in the news business and in the public, Raymond Hill was probably the most arrogant person I'd ever encountered, more so than any public official I've ever dealt with. And that told me something was going on. I mean, this was something big. I mean, all the stone walls, this guy's attitude, people from New York City, $100 million, something big was going on. And that, made me really get into the story. And I had covered government affairs for a long time in Houston. And in Houston, government exists to benefit private people. I mean, that's what they're in there for. And you eventually discover this when you cover it long enough. You realize that all the stuff that's going on the surface is not what's really happening. That they're trying to line their own pockets, and everything else is just kind of smokescreen and smoke and mirrors. And so the important thing in tracking a failed savings loan is to find out where the money went. Just like in covering any investigative story, any government story, what happened to the money? Who got it? Who benefited? And we couldn't find this out. I mean, it was extremely difficult. And everybody else that jumped into investigating the S&L story couldn't either. And most of them stopped trying and went to other kinds of stories, like the personalities involved, the big borrowers and the owners, Charles Keatings and the Don Dixons and these people. And when you start really tracking the money, you find out that these people were just front men and middlemen. They got 1 or 2%, and that was it. They did not get the bulk of the money. And when you start finding out who did, that leads to an entirely new kind of ball game. I mean, you really get into the power structure and the power brokers of this country.
All right, let's talk about the ball game before we get into the players in that game. What is the game that was being played that you discovered?
I'll tell you what I think was going on. I think that people in very powerful positions, mostly in financial institutions like banks that could see what was going on with savings and loans, realized that savings and loans were not going to survive, or we're going to have a very hard time surviving in the early 80s. And I think they just decided to take them down. Savings and loans existed to finance homes for middle America. And so banks had very little use for it. Banks and insurance companies and other finance had very little use for savings and loans. They didn't like them. They were competing for deposits with them. And they were doing something, they were financing middle America's homes. Banks, like to lend to their friends, and this wasn't helping their friends at all. And so I think banks, the people that ran banks, were really wanting the savings and loans to be taken down. And deregulation, for whatever reason it was passed, and there may have been, Congress was just innocent dupes, although I doubt it, just opened the door for this to happen. And the money that was lost went into raw land and existing buildings and developments that never happened. Very little of the money went for construction. That's one of the myths that a lot of people like to perpetrate, that the money was sort of dispersed or atomized into our society through building projects and things like that. Very little money went into raw land and build existing buildings and developments that never happened. And when you find out who owned, the people that owned these assets got most of the money. It's very obvious if you stop and think about it, but nobody did. They looked at Don Dixon, and Charles Keating, and then some of the borrowers, Mike Atkinson, John Riddle, Jack Bona, these wheeler-dealer, high-flying borrowers. The borrowers, although you think, well, they got the money. They got the money, but they turned around and bought something with that money. And the owners of those things they bought got the money. And everybody else involved took the little cut off the top, 1 or 2%. And so when you start looking at who are these people that really got a lot of the money, then you get into the power structure of this country.
And that's where we want to go today with you, Pete Brewton. We're talking about your new book, The Mafia, the C.I.A., and George Bush. And let's talk about some of the people who play a key role in your 400-page, multi-year investigation into this industry, which really puts together some of the most powerful people in America, as we see in the title of the book, George Bush, the current chief of staff. I guess that's where Baker is now. He's also running the Bush campaign. We're talking about, and this is a bipartisan operation, we're talking about Lloyd Benson. We're talking about Orrin Hatch. We're talking about the several of the Bush children. And we're talking about a man by the name of Walter Mischel. Now, Walter Mischer will not ring a bell right away with listeners, but some of the things and the activities that he was involved in and some of the ways that the money was used will begin to ring bells, I believe, for some of the people who hear this broadcast. So let's talk about exactly who Walter Mischer is and what role he played in this whole debacle, which some say could cost ultimately $500 million. If you follow the Stanford Law Review, they estimate $1.4 trillion when you talk about long-term interest loans and borrowing and all that kind of stuff. I believe the Wall Street Journal has come up with a figure of $2 trillion in an editorial. But the point is that it's going to be being paid out by our children and our children's children for years to come. So let's talk about Walter Mischer. Who is he right now? Who is Walter Mischer? And what role does he play in Houston politics and in financial circles throughout the country?
I first ran into Walter Mischer when I was covering county government for the Houston Chronicle. I was the Harris County beat reporter. And his name would start cropping up in conversations with county officials as being a very powerful land developer. That, if Walter Mischer called a public official, they, would get off the phone with even the governor of Texas and talk to Walter Mischer. And it was always in sort of hushed tones and sort of almost like fear was in their voice. And as a land developer, he controlled a lot of real estate projects in Houston. But I also found out, not at the time, because the Harris County government wasn't concerned with banking, he also controlled the third largest bank in Houston called Allied Bank. And then when I moved over to City Hall and covered city government for the Chronicle, it's the same thing all over again. Walter Mischer, you hear him in the background, pulling strings. Everybody's afraid of him. You never see him in public, very rarely. And always, he's kind of a mystery man to me. And when I went over to the Houston Post, started doing investigative reporting, I ran into I'd done some organized crime stories. And in talking to some of the people in Houston that are familiar with organized crime, you kept hearing over again, well, Walter Mischer, of course, is connected to these people. And that kind of was startling information. And also, we'd run into Walter Mischer in a big investigative piece on Herman Hospital, which was a charity hospital in Houston, a very large charity hospital, that was involved in a lot of insider dealings, and they were not operating as a charity. They had lost their mission along the way. And Walter Mischer had served on the board, and his son was then one of the top members of the board. And another reporter and I got involved with investigating Herman Hospital. And of course, that brought our attention back to Walter Mischer. And we ended up doing a story, interviewing him and doing a big story on him. And it was the cover story of a Sunday magazine, the Houston Post. And in that story, in our interview, he admitted that he had actually met and had business discussions with Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans Mafia boss. And we thought that was pretty interesting. And in talking to other people, this was confirmed that, Mischer had ties to the mob.
All right, now let's be clear. We're talking about somebody who is a Houston mover and shaker, who has some kind of substantial relationship with the Bush family. His son went to school with one of the Bush children, George Bush, and recently, and his wife went, and the First Lady went over and had some kind of tea or meeting with Mr. Mischer's only daughter. We're talking about somebody who has a relationship with many officials like this.
Well, Walter Mischer is probably considered the sort of the political power broker of Texas. I mean, he has influenced politicians from Houston City Hall all the way up to the President of the United States. He was very good friends with Lyndon Johnson. Walter Mischer was very, very close to John Conley and other Texas governors, and he's controlled most of the Houston mayors and county politicians in Houston. And he does it behind the scenes. He's a very good fundraiser. I mean, he tells the financial people and the developers who he's going to back, and they will chip in. I mean, he has a lot of influence in determining who the people in Houston business support politically. And, when you start researching his history, you run into some very interesting stuff. And
I want to get to that, but just to
Okay.
complete this relationship, he is not one who stands on party principle. He's been known to support Democrats, Republicans, flip-flop in the middle of races, support who seems to be the winner. In 1988, he had a relationship with Lloyd Bentsen. Lloyd Bentsen depended on him, didn't he?
Well, he's always supported Benson from way back in the 70s. I mean, he served on Benson's campaign committees. He's raised a lot of money for him. In 1988, Benson had his Texas senatorial headquarters in Mischer's building. They've been very close, and it's well known that they are very good friends. And Misher one time denied to me that he'd ever done business with Benson, and I found a land deal where his company and some other people had bought some apartment projects from Benson. And so they're quite close. And Misher will support both sides of the fence. I mean, you got to understand, Misher, politics to him is not like, let's pick out a horse and bet all our money on the horse. They don't bet. They support both sides. If Misher is going to support one candidate, he'll have his associates support the other ones. He covers his bet. These people do not gamble in politics. They always cover their bets. I mean, and so in the 1988 election, you have George Bush as a Republican candidate versus Lloyd Bentsen, the vice president Democratic candidate. I mean, the Houston boys had their bets covered. Either side won, they were in. And so it didn't,
And Bentsen actually ran his vice presidential campaign or both out of offices that were owned by Walter Mischel.
Well, his senatorial campaign, I don't know how you could distinguish the two. I mean, he's doing all of this campaigning as one thing.
Okay, now you began to make some connections between Mr. Misher and organized crime, and we want to get to his relationship with Herman K. Beebe, but take us back to 1952, and Misher also starts another career which tells us that he not only has ties with organized crime, but ties with intelligence and with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yeah. I first ran across people talking about this when we were doing our big story on Misher as the magazine cover. Misher and his partners, including Coca-Cola, had bought 700,000 acres in Belize, a small Central American country, which was approximately 12% of the land of that country. And it turns out that they had vague plans and nothing ever happened. It was all kind of mysterious. And when I was talking to Misher's friends and associates for our story, one of them told me that, he was pretty sure that was a CIA deal that Misher was doing. And, that just kind of went right over my head. I didn't really care about that, and it didn't mean anything. And I thought, well, yeah, maybe so. But I wasn't interested in that. It was only till about 3 years later when I ran across Misher's former son-in-law being involved with the CIA that I remembered what that man had told me. And then I started looking back and see if I could find any other connections. And in 1952, Misher was like 30 years old. He was a sewer contractor. He put in sewers and he paved parking lots. He had like one dump truck and one tractor, or two dump trucks and one tractor. And, and he was very small time. But in 1952, Misher bought into, depending on whether you believe, the first time he talked to me, the second time, he either bought into some paper mills or sawmills in Honduras. And then he sold them in either 54 or 55 to Clint Murchison Jr. At the same time, in 1952, he buys into 26,000 acres in far west Texas, even west of Big Bend National Park on the Rio Grande. And why is he doing that? That's the question. What's going on here? Well, if you look back, what was happening in Honduras in 1952? That's where the C.I.A. and United Fruit Company were planning a coup, basically. of Guatemala, because the liberal government, the Arbenz government, had taken over and were doing land reforms and had nationalized a lot of United Fruit land. United Fruit wanted them out. United Fruit had connections to the CIA through the Dulleses. And the CIA decided they were going to get involved with this. And they began training people in Honduras and Nicaragua in 52 and 53. And here Misher goes down there, and when I asked him about this, he even admitted to meeting Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua. This is the last dictator's father, Anastasio Somoza Garcia. And, I found that just unbelievable. Here's a 30-year-old sewer contractor, with 2 dump trucks and a tractor, owning paper mills in Honduras and hobnobbing with the dictator in Nicaragua. And at the same time, he's buying land, lots of land out on the border with Texas and Mexico. Land that later we find out there's a CIA landing strip right next to it that they were doing guns for drugs into. And I was told by a number of people that Walter Mischel controlled this landing strip. And who'd he sell it to? Who'd he sell his sawmill or paper mill investment after the coup had taken place? He sells it to Clint Murchison Jr., who has documented ties, on the record ties to the CIA. A CIA agent named Robert Cincy testified in court that Clint Murchison Jr. had helped him over in Africa trying to work on some satellite tracking stations. And there's also another connection out in California, a company that some California journalists, Mary Fricker and Steve Pizzo, found out was doing work and a cover for the CIA, and who turns up on the board but Clint Murchison Jr. So here we have, back in 52 already, it really looks like it's circumstantial evidence, but it's highly suspect that something else is going on. When you throw it in also with his current project in Belize, and you find out that his son-in-law's attorney was talking to Oliver North about a project in Belize. At the same time, the CIA was training Contras in Belize, and they're buying 12% of the land mass in the country. It just all fits together, and it's a very plausible explanation, and one that I find pretty persuasive.
Now, it didn't stop in Belize. You carry this story to southern Texas. Could you talk a little bit about these kinds of CIA connections in South Texas?
Well, this is actually far west Texas. But back in the fall of 1988, I was at the Houston Post doing stories on Mafia involvement in savings and loans, and had been for over a year. And my colleague at the Houston Post got a phone call from a woman who was quite irate and chewed him out for not doing very good, he and me, not doing a very good job on a savings and loan story, that we'd missed a lot of this stuff and we didn't know what was going on. So my colleague Greg C. and I went out to see her, and her name was Rebecca Sims, and she had been Robert Corson's accountant. Corson was Mischer's former son-in-law, had been married to Mischer's only daughter, Paula, who earlier this year, George and Barbara Bush went to visit on a secret visit in February, went to their house. And she told us that Corson was a CIA asset, that he...
Rebecca Sims told you?
Yes, Rebecca Sims told us.
And she was there, she was Corson's comptroller?
Well, yeah, accountant, controller, yeah. And Corson also owned a savings and loan in South Texas. And so we started working this, and when Rebecca told me that, I was kind of nonplussed, and I didn't know quite what to make of it. I was really looking for Mafia. I wasn't looking for CIA at all, I had no interest in the CIA at that time. When I got back to the paper and I started thinking about what an organized crime strike force attorney in Kansas City had been telling me. We had been sending him our stories on the Mafia involvement because he was tracking Mafia and bank failures in Kansas City. And there was a person that we had in common, a guy named Mario Renda from Long Island, who was a money broker, a mob money broker. And Renda was down in Mainland Savings and other savings and loans in Texas, and also in Kansas City. And this prosecutor's name was Lloyd Monroe, was investigating Renda and also a failed little bank. And we were sending Lloyd our stories, and he kept telling us, you're missing something big here. These stories, you don't have the whole story. And we didn't know what it was. He wouldn't tell us either. And he was playing his cards close to his vest. And I got back to the Houston Post after talking to Rebecca Sims. I wondered if Lloyd Monroe was talking about the CIA. So I get on a plane, go to Kansas City, and sure enough, that's exactly what he was talking about. So then we started investigating in earnest the CIA. And in the meantime, Rebecca had found out about a guy named Richard Brennicky, who lived in Portland, Oregon, claimed to be an intelligence operative, had gotten some press on the Iran-Contra dealings. In fact, he had helped the New York Times and Newsweek break some Iran-Contra stories. I mean, he had some good information on Iran-Contra. And Rebecca somehow had found out that he might know some things about Walter Mischer and Robert Corson. And so we went to see him, went to Portland, Oregon. I like to make a joke that I spent a month 1 week with Richard Brennicky. I mean, Brennicky's very hard to deal with. As any reporter who's dealt with him will tell you. He talks in vague terms. Sometimes he'll contradict himself one day to the other. He'll act like he knows something one day, and the next day he doesn't know it. And after about a week, I was extremely frustrated with trying to get information from Brennicky. He said he'd worked with Robert Corson. They were laundering Mafia money for the CIA, taking it, down to Panama and Cayman Islands. And he didn't have any really proof. He had Panamanian documents for this company called IFMA, and he had started it with a con man named Ramon Donofrio. You look at Donofrio, and you find mob and CIA connections, documented. I didn't know that at the time. I found it later. So I'm getting rather frustrated. He's telling me a story about a landing strip in Texas that, guns for drugs. I mean, it was CIA and maybe even some Israeli involvement. And so I pulled out a piece of yellow legal paper and I slapped it down on his desk and I said, draw me a picture. Show me exactly where this is and everything you know about it. So he starts drawing a picture. He says, near Lajitas, which is west of Big Bend National Park. And he shows this mesa and he shows where it is. And he says 4,000 feet long and it's double wide, he said. And he said there's a road running at the end of it. And there's this big mountain just north of it. You go over this mesa and it's about like 10 or 12 miles. So I take that piece of paper and I go back to Houston with it. And I'm very frustrated because that's about all I've got in my hands that I can double check that Brennicky told me. I said, if this doesn't check out, I'm blowing Brennicky off. I'm not going to do anything, that's it. So the first thing I do, I get some topographic maps, the USGS Class A 7.5-minute topos of that area that have everything on it. I used to work making these maps, surveying, and they have everything on them. And I said, if that landing strip is out there, it's on this map. I get the map out, no landing strip. So I'm talking to Rebecca about this, and she says, I really believe Brennicky. I think he knows what he's talking about. I said, the only other thing is to either go out there or get the aerial photographs that the USGS uses to make these maps. So I do that. I order them. And I get a stereoscope. You can take these aerial photographs and you can look at them with a stereoscope and it pops up out at you at 3D. So I'm looking on the map, on the photographs. I'm following out from Lajitas and you go over this big mesa and here's this little mountain, and there the landing strip was. I mean, exactly the way he described it. And it's not on the topographic map. And so then I went out there, and it was exactly the way he had described it. Not only that, there had been tremendous activity there. There were holes and burn piles and roads, and the county actually maintains a fairly good road. Even though it's the middle of nowhere, there's nothing around there. You could get a big fuel truck or water truck up there. And one of the things that struck me, I went out there with another Post reporter who was familiar with that area, were these huge tire tracks that were running parallel to on both sides of the runway, which was, as Brennecke described it, double wide, and it was 4,000 feet long. The 4,000 feet is very significant. If you look at most of the other runways, dirt runways in that area, they were like 2,000 feet to accommodate, a little single-engine Cessna or something like that. Well, why 4,000 feet? Well, 4,000 feet was because they were flying C-130s into there. And the minimum takeoff of fully loaded C-130 is 3,700 feet. So you just got barely enough, and this is on the only flat area within miles of this place. It's the only flat area, but there are no sudden rises on either side of the runway, so you can get a fully loaded C-130 in and out of there pretty easy. I started talking to people in that area, lawmen. Some of them wouldn't talk. Finally got it confirmed that, what Brennecke had said that it was used for, that it was, guns and drugs. And
tell me, what you say, lawmen, what kind of people confirmed what Brennecke said? And I'm asking you this, as you know, Pete, for a very good reason, because there's been a lot of publicity and a lot of articles that discredit Richard Brennecke. There was an endless story in the Village Voice that was written by Frank Snapp, a former CIA officer who was in Vietnam under Tom Polgar, who says that Brennecke can't believe a word this man says. So help us understand why you, a careful reporter, would believe Richard Brennecke.
Okay. Number one, the contractor who put this strip in, a man out in that country, although he wouldn't talk about what was going on, did confirm that there were gun shipments in there, and there were people going out there shooting off high-powered weapons. Two longtime law enforcement officials in that area who cover border activities, who specifically know about smuggling and narcotics, confirmed that this was a guns for drugs strip, and the CIA was involved. Also, Brennecke told me that he flew into that strip one time with some people from the Medellin cartel, and he asked them, whose landing strip is this? And they said it was Walter Mischer's. Brennecke, by the way, had met Walter Mischer earlier in Houston, that Robert Corsenet had introduced him to Mischer at the Allied Bank building. This landing strip, by the way, is owned on a piece of property by a widow in Florida who did not even know it was there. So they chose it quite carefully. I mean, she never went out to the site. She wouldn't have any knowledge of this. And she said it was built there without her knowledge or permission. So we've got two or three already confirmations. Then I found a CIA contract pilot by the name of Tosh Plumlee. The San Diego Reader had done a long story on him a couple of years ago, and he had talked about his career as a contract pilot for the CIA, guns and drugs in Latin America. And he talked about flying into Texas. And I wondered if he might be familiar with the strip. Tosh Plumlee, by the way, is mentioned in several books on the Contra affair, but only by his first name, Tosh. Apparently, the writers that wrote about him or talked to him or knew about him only knew him by his nickname, Tosh. He's mentioned as a CIA contract pilot in a book called The Fish is Red, about Operation Mongoose, the CIA's operation against Castro, in which he flew CIA contract flying in and out around Cuba. But in that book, he's only called Robert Plumlee. And apparently no one ever made the connection that this Robert Plumlee is the Tosh of the Contras. And it turns out it's the same guy. I mean, he is the real thing, and very well documented. So I called him up, and I asked him about this landing strip, and he confirmed. In fact, he told me, I asked him if he knew Richard Brennecke. First of all, he said he didn't know him, never heard of him. But he said that this strip was actually more active in 82 and 83 with shipments in and out of Latin America, and also involving the Israelis.
Shipments of what?
Guns, and these are high-powered weapons. In fact, Brennecke told me these were more high-powered than the Contras would be using. I mean, so you're talking probably artillery and stuff like this, going down to Latin America. And Brennecke had said the same thing. And a Texas Ranger out in that area who first told me that the strip was well-maintained and quite active in the early 80s, and then later called me and tried to deny that there was any activity there at all. A lot of people out there are trying to protect this operation.
Now, where was Walter Mischer's land in because this wasn't his land, so
No.
why would he be implicated? I mean, didn't he told you he wasn't, he had no affiliation with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Right.
In fact, he said he would have somebody write a letter, didn't he?
Well, he said he was working on getting someone to get the CIA to write a letter claiming that he had never worked for him. Of course, if they'd done that, that would almost be proof positive that he did. I mean, that'd be the only way you could get a letter like that. The only other letter I'm aware of like that was the one the CIA wrote saying that Heinrich Rupp and Richard Brennecke hadn't worked for them. Of course, the jury in Portland, Oregon decided that he had, and the CIA later had to recant and say that Heinrich Rupp had indeed worked or been trained in one of their proprietaries. So, a letter from the CIA is not worth very much.
All right, and so Mischer's land was...
Okay, Misher is the biggest landowner in that. He owns hundreds of thousands of acres in that vicinity. He owns the town of Lajitas. He's trying to develop as the Palm Springs of Texas. He and Robert O. Anderson, the former chairman of the board of Atlantic Richfield, own 250,000 acres in that vicinity. The eastern border is it was 2 or 3 miles to the west of this landing strip. He also owned land south of the landing strip. So he's got land on 2 sides of the landing strip. And of course, a C-130, one of its characteristics is being able to conduct low-level drops. And it's not unusual for a C-130 to go in and drop somewhere and then land somewhere else.
We're talking with Pete Brewton. He is the author of a new book, The Mafia, the C.I.A., and George Bush, and we're going to get to George Bush and the Bush family in 1 minute. But we're talking about Walter Mischer, who is an associate of Bush, of people like James Baker, and many, many powerful people in this country. And you were talking about before where Mr. Mischer's power derives from. So can you talk about where that comes from, this virtually unknown to Americans, where this man comes from, and how it works for him to give him his, and how it works for him to give him his power.
Okay, Misher, we don't know how. He's a man of mystery. Sometime back in the 40s or 50s, became involved with both the Mafia and the CIA, and he's a middleman. He's a functionary that flows back and forth between these entities and politicians and banks. And his power derives from the fact that he has these connections to the Mafia and to the CIA and to politicians. And Mischer's connection to Bush, although there are some personal connections, Mischer says he's known Bush for a long time but doesn't know him well. You look and you see that you have Bush visiting his daughter. You have them both socializing at the Houston Country Club. You've got them both and their families involved in the ritziest private school in Houston. But when the real connections between Bush and Mischer are people like Robert Mosbacher, who is Bush's campaign finance chairman, his money man. And Mischer bought over 5,000 acres from Mosbacher and his partners one time. Misher and Bush and a man named Albert Belfay, who was the father of the Republican Party in Houston that Bush called his mentor. And you find Albert Belfay doing business with Misher and his son-in-law. It's Misher and Bush and a man named Jimmy Lyon, who is the father of the right-wing Republicans in Houston, had a bank called River Oaks Bank and Trust. Both of them doing business with Jimmy Lyon. It's Misher and a county judge in Houston named John Lindsay and Bush. Lindsay's between them both. You can take a number of, it's even like Lloyd Benson. I mean, Bush and Benson were, tennis partners at the Houston Country Club. It's Misher and a mobster named Herman K. Beebe and Beebe's partner named Harvey McLean, and then McLean to Bush. McLean worked on Bush's 1980 campaign. They had a long conversation together in New Orleans in 1980. And McLean started a little bank in Washington, D.C. called Palmer National Bank that was doing favors for Republicans and helping the Contras and also doing deals with Herman K. Beebe. I mean, it's the circle. It's this circle of Houston businessmen that both Bush and Benson are part of and Misher is part of. It's Misher and one of his right-hand men named Jack Trotter and a man named William Blakemore, a Midland oil man who's very close then to Bush. So you can draw you see all these connections, and it goes to political power. And so even though you don't see Misher and Bush going out drinking together, they have these very, very strong connections. And I think Misher is probably, used to be anyway, one of the most, if not the most powerful man in this country, and very few people outside Texas knew about him.
All right, let's go to the title of your book, and let's see if we can cut to the quick here. The title is The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush. And obviously you have the President of the United States name in there right under the CIA and the Mafia because you believe there's some pretty close connections.
That's something that no one else knew about, that George Bush personally intervened in the federal regulation of a very extremely dirty savings and loan in Florida that was doing deals with Mafia people and C.I.A. people. And this never came out. It was in the national press. I found it in the Miami Review, which is a legal magazine in Miami. They were covering the trial of some of the executives of Sunrise Savings, which is out of Boynton Beach, Florida, north of Miami. And at that time, Sunrise Savings was one of the largest failures in the country. Its failure cost taxpayers about $700 million. In 1988, the federal officials responsible for keeping track of the assets of failed savings and loans said 4/5 of all the assets they were dealing with in failed savings loans were out of Sunrise Savings. Sunrise Savings was making loans to Ray Corona, making loans to John Riddle, very close friend of Walter Mischel and Robert Corson. They were making loans to a man named Harold White, who we find out is in business with some mob associates and some men who were connected to the CIA. And so at that time, journalists, at least with the Miami Review covering the story, didn't realize what Sunrise Savings was. And apparently no one else picked up on this. But the story was, and it was confirmed to me by someone who has personal knowledge of it, and it was testified to at the trial, was that the chief executive officer of Sunrise went to George Bush when he was vice president, went to his office, complained about the federal regulators cracking down on Sunrise Savings. Bush called in the person a woman underneath Ed Gray, who headed the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, and dressed her down and told her to back off of Sunrise Savings. It later failed, cost us $700 million and millions of dollars to people with connections to the Mafia and the CIA. This has never come out. I mean, here we have Bush personally intervening in the failure, in a savings and loan whose failure cost taxpayers $700 million. Of course, the more notorious connections are to Neil Bush and Silverado savings. But we have also the connection of George Bush to Misher, who then is involved in a number of failed savings and loans. And
we have Baker, who has been Bush's key player, advisor, interceding on behalf of, in some very serious situations that...
It appears to. I mean, I think there's a significant circumstantial evidence that shows that Baker was somehow involved in mainland savings, or the lack of prosecution of mainland savings. You recall mainland savings was the first savings and loan that I started looking at, and we found Mafia and C.I.A., strong-time C.I.A. involvement in mainland, including a major loan to Adnan Khashoggi at the same time Khashoggi was funding the first publicized arms for hostages deal with Iran. The chair of the board of mainland was Raymond Hill. The Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation hired a private law firm out of Houston to investigate the failure of mainland to file a lawsuit against the officers and directors to try to recover the money that was lost. This law firm was Andrews and Kurth. Now, Andrews and Kurth conducted an investigation. Their lawyers drew up a 60-page complaint or petition or lawsuit to be filed against Raymond Hill and other officers and directors of mainland, alleging various and numerous cases of fraud. In many cases, these were criminal allegations. And they said that Raymond Hill, in a 4-year period, had gotten salaries and payments from mainland of over $4.3 million. Mainland's failure, by the way, probably cost taxpayers about $500 million. This lawsuit, was never filed. And Greg C. and I wrote some stories about why is the federal regulators not filing a lawsuit in mainland? Because the statute of limitations was about to run. They only had 2 or 3 years after the failure to file a lawsuit to try to recover the money, and they let it run. The FSLIC the feds let this lawsuit run, so it was never filed. And we wrote a big story about this, criticizing the feds and Andrews and Kurth. Well, the next day I got a phone call from someone in Andrews Kurth who told me that they had drawn up a lawsuit, but that it was killed at the top levels of the FSLIC and Andrews Kurth. And I said, well, I'd like to see that. And so this person mailed me a copy of the lawsuit, and it had all these allegations, and we wrote a number of stories about this. It wasn't until several years later, after I'd finished investigating mainland, that I found out from a number of people that Raymond Hill was very close and very good friends to James A. Baker III, now the White House Chief of Staff, former Secretary of State, and at the time of mainland's failure was the Secretary of the Treasury. Okay,
and ultimately in charge of all regulation.
Yes. So that kind of, that's something's going on. I was struck by that. And also, James Baker was the former managing partner of Andrews and Kurth, the law firm hired by the FSLIC to investigate mainland's failure, and ultimately did nothing, did not file a lawsuit against Raymond Hill. And I think, of course, this is one of the reasons that Raymond Hill was so arrogant, because he knew not only did he have the Mafia and the C.I.A., he had James Baker behind him.
Okay, let's get back now to George Bush. We're talking about George Bush and specifically connections between George Bush and the Mafia and the CIA. And before we go on to the boys, the Bush boys, you talked about that Florida situation where the then Vice President George Bush interceded. Be very clear about who the players were in which he was interceding and how they were connected to the Mafia.
All right. The S&L was Sunrise Savings. At the time, Sunrise Savings was making loans with and dealing with a man named John Riddle, who was a friend of Walter Mischer's. He's a Houston businessman and attorney, a close friend and partner of Robert Corson, the CIA agent and Mischer's former son-in-law. He borrowed $30 to $40 million from Sunrise Savings, and the loans had gone bad. Riddle also had an airplane company called First Western Aviation that was financed by the bank of one of Mischer's closest friends and associates. And according to Ari Ben Menashe, an Israeli intelligence officer, was shipping guns to Iran and Iraq. First Western was John Riddle's company. All right. They also were making loans to a man named Ray Corona, who owned a bank in Florida called Sunshine State Bank. It was called a Mafia bank by federal regulators. Its biggest borrower was Leonard Palullo, a Philadelphia Mafia associate, well-known, well-documented Mafia associate. It was also making loans to a man named Harold White, who was in partners with a man named Donald Berg, who has been mentioned in connection with Richard Nixon and B.B. Rebozo in deals down in Florida, and was also a close friend of Louis Chesler, who was Meyer Lansky, the mob's financial wizard's partner. And his attorney, Harold White's attorney, was Truman Skinner. Truman Skinner was the former managing partner of Paul Hellowell's law firm. Paul Hellowell is one of the founders and masterminds of the Central Intelligence Agency, one of the original founders who started the CIA as one of their first proprietaries, C Supply, that was funneling weapons into Thailand for the nationalist Chinese. Hellowell is one of the top CIA operatives. Here, his partner, Truman Skinner, turns up as Harold White's partner. And then we have Donald Berg, partners with Louis Chesler, a Mafia associate, partners with Harold White. Harold White's borrowing from Sunrise Savings. Ray Corona's borrowing, John Riddle's borrowing. Those are the only three I found. It would be, if I had enough time, it'd be nice to go back and try to find all the loans.
And this is the one that George Bush that comes in and he says, what to the
right? He says, back off. And you think if Bush was going to tell anybody to back, he'd tell somebody to back off Mainland or Silverado Savings, where his son was. Why a savings loan in Florida? And that's what nobody caught on at the time. But then you find out, look, they're making loans too. And then, it makes sense then.
Well, why would George Bush not want the Mafia to be prosecuted?
Well, I think because he's got too many connections to them. And they're indirect. It's not like, Gambino associate, John Gotti walks into, Bush's office and says, hey, George, I got a deal for you. It's all the intermediaries. It's like Herman Beebe and Walter Mischer and these people that connect to Bush.
Okay, let's go to, you mentioned the name Herman K. Beebe, and most people don't know who that is, although he has cost taxpayers in the hundreds of millions, if not the billions of dollars. And let's go through that door through Neil Bush. Neil Bush was a director at Silverado. He was on the board of Gulfstream. He made some very interesting, or helped to facilitate some very interesting loans to Ken Good and Bill Walters for over $100 million. So what's the Bush Mafia CIA connection there? And I guess Herman K. Beebe comes into it. Yeah, and how fast can you do it?
Let me explain a little about Herman K. Beebe. Herman K. Beebe is a Mafia associate from Louisiana. He's tied into the Carlos Marcello Mafia family out of New Orleans. He is called the godfather of the failed Texas S&Ls. He was involved in at least a dozen failed Texas savings and loans. Some of the most notorious, like Vernon and Mainland and Western and Sunbelt. He worked behind the scenes. He would finance the purchase of savings and loans by his associates. And then he and his buddies would get loans out of these. Mainland Savings is listed in the Comptroller of the Currency Report as being one of the S&Ls influenced or controlled by Herman K. Beebe, as a dozen others are. He was eventually caught by the U.S. Attorney in Shreveport and pled guilty to bank fraud and did like 10 whole months in the federal penitentiary. Probably worked on his golf game. Now he's out.
You mentioned Malin, just that once again, that's the
James Baker.
That's the James Baker where he allegedly interceded. Okay.
So Beebe, it also was tied in with mobsters out in La Costa, California, and also I found him in a gun deal in 1972 involved with Barry Seal, who was a C.I.A. Contract man involved with a Gambino family associate out of New York. And there are a number of intelligence ties to Beebe as well as the CIA, including this bank in Washington, D.C. called Palmer
National Bank, which he helped to finance through
Right.
another associate.
Right.
And this is the bank that Spitz Channel used in helping to fund the Contras.
Right. And Stephen Halper was the partner with Herman K. Beebe's man. Okay. Stephen Halper became chairman of the board while Harvey McLean, Herman K. Beebe's boy, put up the $3 million initial capital that came from Herman K. Beebe's bank in Shreveport, Louisiana. Halper had been a long-time sort of political operative involved in political espionage. He served as Bush's director of policy issues during Bush's 1980 presidential campaign. Then went to work for the State Department, and then started Palmer National Bank with Harvey McLean.
And Halper, just to be another one of his adventures, may have been the fact that he helped to pilfer information from the Carter campaign, what was later called DebateGate, where Carter's debate notes were stolen for the Reagan-Bush campaign.
That's great. Yeah, Halper was implicated, and I think about that time he left the board of Palmer National Bank. Halper also is the last entry in Oliver North's White House diaries. The last entry is legal defense firm Stephen Halper. And Halper was very close to Oliver North. It's not surprising because Halper's father-in-law was Ray Klein, who was one of the original fathers of the CIA and deputy director of intelligence of the CIA. And Halper was very close to Oliver North. It's not surprising because Halper's father-in-law was Ray Klein, who was one of the original fathers of the CIA and deputy director of intelligence of the CIA for years.
Okay, so we've been talking about Herman K. Beebe. We've been setting the tone because he does intersect then with Neil Bush and Silverado.
Yes. The second largest borrower at Silverado was Bill Walters, who was a Denver architect who had financed Neil Bush's entry into the oil business. And he was Neil Bush's sugar daddy, and most of the money that came from him paid Neil Bush's salary while his company drilled dry hole after dry hole. Bill Walters and his associated companies borrowed close to $100 million from Silverado Savings. In addition, they sold property close to $100 million to Silverado, which caused them to lose money. Well, Bill Walters shows up in Texas 10 years earlier doing business with Herman K. Beebe. Walters had a partner named Richard Rossmiller, who, although did not borrow from Silverado, borrowed from a number of other failed savings and loans and close to $200 million, went bankrupt, cost the taxpayers a lot of money. Rossmiller and Walters came down to Texas and bought a bank from Beebe's associates. It was part of the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal, where they were swapping loans back and forth, sort of the precursor to the S&L debacle. There were some direct business dealings between Beebe and Walters' partner, Rossmiller, involved in a dirty S&L in Houston at that time. And so then Walters goes back to Denver and starts financing Neil Bush and borrowing from Silverado Savings. Another of Neil Bush's sugar daddies, Kenneth Good, came from Texas. Good was borrowing money from Silverado. He also bought Gulfstream Land and Development Company in Florida and put Neil Bush on the board at $100,000 a year director's salary. And one of the places where Good got some money to buy Gulfstream was Western Savings in Dallas, which was one of the Herman K. Beebe connected S&Ls. Another figure in the Silverado crowd was a Canadian businessman named John Dick, who was tied in with Richard Rossmiller and was doing business with people in Houston connected to Herman K. Beebe. And finally, we have the second, I was mistaken. Bill Walters was the biggest borrower at Silverado, the number one largest. The second was a man named Ellison Trine Starnes Jr. And Trine Starnes Jr., E. Trine Starnes, was from Houston, borrowed $77 million from Silverado. Nobody seemed to know very much about him. He just came out of the clear to get $77 million, bought a orange juice factory in Florida, a hotel in Breckenridge, Colorado, and some buildings in Colorado Springs. You trace E. Trine Starnes back. And by the way, these loans are the part of the loans that Neil Bush and his directors were sued about by the federal regulators. I mean, that was one of the big loans they talk about. How could you approve something like this? It was part of this suit against the officers and directors. You look back at E. Trine Starnes, a con man, probably the biggest con man in American history, and nobody hardly knows anything about him. His second bankruptcy may have totaled approximately $500 million he borrowed from banks and savings and loans and didn't pay back. Well, his first bankruptcy was in the middle 70s. He gets out, and who does he get financed from first? Right out of his first bankruptcy, but Mischer's Allied Bank. And then where does he go to borrow money during the 80s? He borrows it from Continental Savings in Houston, which was financed and controlled by Herman K. Beebe. Okay. Also, Trine Starnes was partners with our fellow friend John Riddle, the man who was borrowing money from Sunrise Savings. By the way, I forgot to mention, the federal prosecutors at Sunrise gave Riddle immunity from prosecution in return for his cooperation, which I don't know if he even cooperated or not. But they either didn't know who he was or were told to leave him alone. In fact, there's one federal regulator in Washington that refers to Riddle as the Teflon John because he's escaped prosecution. He borrowed over $200 million from failed savings and loans and didn't pay it back.
Now, for all of this, for all of his work here, essentially the punishment that Neil Bush received was that if he wants to get involved in another federally insured institution, he should be a little more careful?
That's correct. Yeah, he agreed to do that he would avoid conflicts of interest in the future.
Why did it take the regulators so long to close down that bank?
Well,
that savings and loans
that's another one of the things that that's no reporter has been able to get to the bottom of. All we know is that the federal regulators were ready to take Silverado down in the fall of 1988. And the regulator in charge out of Topeka, Kansas, Kenneth Mowbray, waited until the week after the election that George Bush won before he took Silverado down. And apparently he was instructed by someone in Washington, D.C., I'm sure someone high up, to hold off. And we don't know who that is, and there's been a lot of speculation, but it's never been nailed down.
All right, there's another Bush boy, Jeb Bush. And could you talk a little bit about Jeb Bush and his relationship to Camilo Pedrada?
Camilo Pedrada? Well, Jeb lives in Miami and is, very close to the Cuban community there.
He's a mover and shaker in Dade County. Right. He's a key player in the local Republican politics. I
think he was former chairman of the Republican Party in Dade County. He's involved in, real estate business with a man named Codina. Jeb was also involved in a business deal with a man named Camilo Pedrada, another Cuban exile. Pedrada pled guilty to HUD fraud, I think last year. But back about 10 years ago, Pedrada's business partner, Guillermo Hernandez Cartaya, had bought a savings and loan in South Texas called Jefferson Savings from Lloyd Benson's family. Benson, by the way, at first tried to deny that he even owned any stock in this S&L. And fortunately, I had a notarized document from the Texas Savings and Loan Department to show that he was one of the original founders and stockholders. And when I told his press secretary that, then they changed their story and then agreed that he had been a stockholder. But his father sold this savings loan to Guillermo Hernandez Cortaya, who's one of the all-time bad boys of the Western Hemisphere. Another Cuban exile.
What do you mean?
Well, he was Cuban exile. He was a member of the famous Brigade 2506 that fought in the Bay of Pigs. He was captured, then ransomed back by our government. He went to work for a bank in Atlanta, and then he started a company in Florida. And this company ended up doing money laundering, drug smuggling, weapons deals, and dealing with the Mafia and the C.I.A. When the local prosecutor in Florida tried to go after Cartaya, the CIA put a stop to it. Okay, they basically shut off the investigation. In the meantime, during this time, he buys this S&L from Lloyd Benson's family. And before that, he had served on the board of directors with Benson's father and Benson's brother. Okay, he immediately starts laundering drug money through there and looting this S&L. The prosecutors come down, they start prosecuting him. The CIA comes down and tells the U.S. Attorney's Office to please back off because he's one of theirs. And he's done favors for the United States, including, they said, scamming $30 million from Saudi Arabia. Actually, I think it was from Abu Dhabi, one of the Emirates. And it was a well-documented escapade of Cartaya's where he basically took $37 million out of this bank.
So here you have Benson and the Benson family in business with somebody who has got all kinds of legal problems, including some convictions, and he's also okayed by the FDIC.
Yes.
Why would the FDIC trust this man?
I don't know, but the Texas regulators found out about him immediately. I mean, he started doing wild deals, and they came down to try to shut him off, and the top Texas S&L examiner, Art Leiser, told me that he was sitting in a bar when they were having a drink with an FBI agent that was doing some undercover work there at Jefferson Savings. And Art said, what is it about Cartaya? He's so bad, yet nothing happens to him. And the FBI agent turned to him and said, did you ever think about the CIA? Of course, this was about the time the CIA was coming to the Justice Department to try to get them back off. Well, Justice went ahead and convicted him of bank fraud, but that conviction was rolled into his IRS conviction out of Florida, and it was only total about 5 years. The next year, there was another indictment brought against Hernandez Cartaya and his partner, Camilo Padreda, who later shows up in business with Jeb Bush. And that indictment was eventually dropped by the Justice Department, and the judge also asked that it be dropped.
Now, what kind of business were they doing together? What kind of business was Padreda doing with Jeb, the president's son?
Jeb and his partner actually built an office building for Padreda. They constructed his office building. They also constructed an office building, or were going to, for a guy named Alberto Duque, who was a Colombian exile that was eventually later convicted of bank fraud. And also there was another S&L deal involving Jeb Bush that the New York Times wrote about. I'm not that familiar with it, but his partner was a man named J. Edgar Houston. And their loan, I think, went bad, and it cost taxpayers some money. And we'll find Houston later showing up as a partner of a man trying to get involved in a big Florida land deal.
All right, just before, we're going to sort of change the story to what happened in trying to put together this kind of investigation, the kinds of roadblocks and hurdles you had in getting this information out. And this is Dennis Bernstein, and we are here with Susan Burns, who's joining us now. We're speaking with Pete Brewton, who is the author of a new book, The Mafia, the C.I.A., and George Bush, the current president of the United States. And I want to just throw out, so do a quick back and forth. There are many, many names in your book, and people are going to have to go out and read it to find out some more of the details, and there are quite a few details, and there appears to be excellent documentation. But let me just do a quick back and forth on some names that I think are interesting and people should at least hear. Tell us about Farhad Hazima, Indian Springs Bank, and where Lloyd Monroe comes into this picture.
Farhad Hazima was an Iranian native, is an Iranian native. He now lives in London, but he lived in Kansas City for over 30 years, and he had a very interesting airline company called Global International Airways that did work for the CIA. And Hazima was a C.I.A. asset. And my book, really nails this down. Hazima has denied it. And a lot of people have worked on Hazima and all the smoke and around him involving with the CIA. And I've got really nailed down his involvement with the CIA, including a statement from a former CIA officer who was on the Iranian desk during Iran-Contra, confirming that Farhad Hazima and Global International Airways worked for the CIA in doing weapons deals. Hazima and his company were big borrowers, and Hazima was on the board of directors of Indian Springs State Bank in Kansas City, Kansas. This was basically a mob-controlled bank. A mobster by the name of Anthony Russo was bringing in mob business from Kansas City, also Chicago and St. Louis. Morris Shanker, the notorious mob lawyer for Jimmy Hoffa, was getting money from Indian Springs, and it failed. And Hazima's and his affiliated companies ended up costing this bank some money. One of the private attorneys was brought in to investigate the failure, said that Hazima and his companies did contribute to the failure of Indian Springs State Bank. One of the people investigating Indian Springs State Bank was an organized crime prosecutor named Lloyd Monroe, who I told you earlier we had been in contact with because Mario Renda, this New York mobster, was brokering deposits into Indian Springs State Bank, as well as into Mainland Savings and another savings and loans in Texas. So we were following him, and that's how we got in contact with Lloyd Monroe. Monroe was investigating Indian Springs State Bank. He was told by an IRS investigator that Farhad Hazima, was doing some extremely questionable things, and that he was involved in Indian Springs State Bank. Hazima was involved with this mobster named Anthony Russo, and involved with a mob associate named Jay Finn, and he needed investigating by the FBI as part of their Indian Springs State Bank investigation. So Lloyd Monroe, instructed his FBI agents that were doing this to look into Hazima. And several days later, they reported back to him that Hazima had, quote, a get-out-of-jail-free card because he worked for the CIA. And Monroe was then told by his superiors not to investigate Hazima. This IRS agent continued and tried to get the Justice Department to prosecute Hazima, but he never had any success. Hazima, in the interim, had moved to London, which, as Lloyd Monroe pointed out, does not have an extradition agreement with the United States on IRS charges.
Now, it's interesting that at one point when Monroe was trying to corner Hazima, Hazima said he couldn't show up for an interview because he had an appointment at the White House.
Well, he was having to testify in Anthony Russo's trial, and he was set up to testify at a certain date, and he had to call in and change it because he was going to a meeting at the White House. It turned out to be a Republican fundraising event that Ronald Reagan was there and George Bush was there, and Hazima had been donating large sums of money to the Republican Party, and only started it, by the way, right when he filed for bankruptcy for Global International Airways.
Now, Global and related airlines that Hazima was associated with had some very interesting jobs. I think perhaps the most hysterical thing that I've ever heard is you have Anthony Russo essentially working with the CIA to bring in Samuel Doe into the...
Yes, as you recall, when Sergeant Samuel Doe from Liberia led a coup in 1980, And the CIA was extremely concerned about this because they had some very special satellite tracking equipment in Liberia. And as you recall, Clint Murchison Jr. was working with a CIA operative named Robert Sensi on maybe trying to get some other satellite tracking equipment in some other countries close to there, while the CIA was trying to get close to Doe. And so the CIA hired Farhad Azima at Global International Airways to fly Doe on this round-the-world trip. And the person that they also got to be sort of their personal emissary to sort of show Doe around was Anthony Russo, a convicted mobster who had been convicted of bribery and promoting interstate prostitution.
So
this guy was also had been brought in to help run Indian Springs State Bank after his conviction, and the local FDIC office protested, and the Washington people overruled their protest and said Russo could come in and work for this bank.
So Farhad Azima has got a get-out-of-jail-free card. Anthony Russo, who is convicted of promoting prostitution, a federal offense across state lines, is now elevated to the status of diplomat and entertaining a foreign head of state for the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yes.
What an interesting story.
Well, you know, when you want to protect the national security of the United States, you got to break a few eggs.
Let's talk about.
Being facetious.
Let's break a few more eggs here. Who's William Blackmore?
William Blakemore.
Blakemore.
William Blakemore is a Midland oil man who's very strong, right-wing Republican. He and George Bush go way back. When George Bush first moved to Texas, he came to Midland, got in the oil business, met Blakemore then. Blakemore and he are extremely close. Blakemore was a very strong supporter of the Contras. Blakemore started an organization called the Gulf Foundation and Gulf and Caribbean Foundation that was, trying to convince Congress to send weapons to the Contras. They hired Michael Ledeen, one of the sort of architects of the Iranian arms for hostages, to write a pamphlet for them, to try to convince Congress. They raised a lot of money. They're all over Oliver North's White House diaries. It's interesting that all of the news accounts about the Gulf and Caribbean Foundation never mentioned William Blakemore. And he was the power behind it, the chairman, because they had hired Dan Kirkendall, who was originally from Texas and became a congressman from Tennessee and now a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., to be their front man. And all the accounts everywhere, I mean everywhere, just talk about Dan Kirkendall. No, and Gulf and Caribbean is in the middle of that chart the investigators found in Oliver North's safe, diagramming the Contra aid system. And no one ever said, who's behind Gulf? It was always Dan Kirkendall. They never got to William Blakemore. Okay? Blakemore married a Houston oil man's daughter, a guy named Jim Silver Dollar West. He used to carry silver dollars around in his pocket and hand them out to people. His other daughter married a man who was one of the powers behind Tracor, the defense firm in Austin, Texas. And Misher's, one of Misher's closest associates, Jack Trotter, was also involved in Tracor. Trotter was one of the trustees of the West Daughters Trust. Okay, the attorney who represented the interests of the Somoza family from Nicaragua in Houston was also another trustee of this trust and represented the interests of William Blakemore in other places. So Blakemore very strongly connected to Bush, to the Misher circle in Houston, and to the Contras. Blakemore has a ranch in West Texas called the Iron Mountain Ranch. It's got a 5,000-foot landing strip. A number of investigators has tracked gun shipments and training of guerrilla forces on the Iron Mountain Ranch. And in fact, one investigator, Gene Wheaton, who used to work for the Pentagon as a criminal investigator, said that Iron Mountain Ranch was also connected into the Lajitas landing strip that the CIA was using.
This is the drugs and guns operation.
Yes. Now, when you ask Blakemore, what about guns and the training at your ranch, he will say something like, well, I can't, I was involved in lots of stuff with the Army and armed forces, and some of it's classified, and obviously I can't talk about it. I mean, he doesn't specifically deny it.
Mansour Harani and Orrin Hatch.
Mansour Harani is a Lebanese native who lives in Houston. He's not well known in Houston. He's sort of low profile, but he was. And I found Mansour Harani looking for Robert Corson. I went to the courthouse and I started looking at all the records of Robert Corson, and there I found Mansour Harani doing a land deal with Robert Corson.
Corson is the CIA mule, the courier,
Right.
who is helping to launder money for the CIA for
Right.
Iran-Contra operations.
Well, or whatever they were using it for. Also, Mischer's former son-in-law, who owned a savings and loan in South Texas that was busted out by this one Florida land deal that had all these CIA mob people involved and money going to out of Jersey, probably or possibly to buy weapons for Iraq and Iran. Anyway, Harani married a woman from Utah, a Mormon woman, and actually he converted to Mormonism. And he's involved in lots of land deals in the Houston area, including land deals with Lamar Savings and Mainland Savings. He got lots of money from Mainland Savings. During the investigation of Mainland Savings, Harani came under attack by the federal regulators. His good friend, Orrin Hatch, the senator from Utah, wrote a letter to the federal regulators asking and almost telling them, threatening them to back off of Mansour Harani, because if they don't, they could get into trouble. And as far as I know, no lawsuit, no action was ever taken against Mansour Harani.
It was interesting. He called you up and he threatened you, I think it was with a $10 million lawsuit. He said, even as we speak, my lawyers are drawing up the lawsuit. Were you nervous?
No, I had some additional ammunition. I started asking questions about weapons deals to the Middle East, about the C.I.A., about the Mossad. He used to brag about his connections to the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. His connections to Robert Corson, Mike Atkinson, who was one of Corson's associates, is also doing weapons deals, and his connection to Mainland Savings, Lamar Savings. And at the end of that conversation, after I'd asked him those questions, he decided that he was going to forget about filing a lawsuit.
This is Dennis Bernstein. We're talking to Pete Brewton about his new book, the Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush. And it's going to be out. It's just coming out right now. It's on Tripolsky Press out of New York City. This is a special radio broadcast in which we're talking about the collapse of some of America's most powerful SNLs and banks. I want to ask you just about a few more people. For instance, what about Jim Bath and his relationship to Len Benson, the son of Lloyd Benson, and to George W. Bush, the son of the president?
Yeah, well, Jim Bath is one of the most interesting characters in the book. The title of the chapter on Bath is called "The C.I.A. Takes a Bath." It's interesting that someone else who's worked researching Jim Bath wrote a little article for a magazine, I can't remember who, but his title of it was "Bush Takes a Bath." Jim Bath owns an airplane operation in Houston. He's originally from Louisiana, came to Houston when he was 29 years old with the shirt on his back, and went to work at the Air National Guard in Houston, flying airplanes. While he was there, he met George W. Bush, the president's son, and also Lloyd Benson III, the senator's son. And he started working for Atlantic Aviation, which is owned by the DuPont family. The DuPont family shows up with a number of connections to the CIA and connections to the Florida land deal. I hope we talk about it in a minute. He then had met Lan Benson, the other senator's son, through Lloyd III. They went into the real estate business together in '76 and bought and sold land and apartments, and continued. Although they claimed they had separated after a couple of years, Bath continued to use the Bath-Benson letterhead. Even up until a couple of years ago, he was sending letters to the feds under the Bath-Benson letterhead. He also had been, I believe, and there's credible testimony from one of his former partners that George Bush, when Bush had been director of the CIA in 1976, had recruited Bath to be a CIA asset to keep track of some Saudi Arabians who were investing in the United States through Bath. One of these was just indicted for his role in the BCCI scandal. Bath also borrowed money from Lamar Savings and Mainland Savings. And he got into trouble. The loan went bad, but Mainland Savings bailed him out, and the person who ended up taking over this loan was Mansour Hirani, that Mainland and a mob loan broker at Mainland had brought in.
Once again, Mainland is the one that Baker may have interceded in.
Correct, and tied into Misher. I mean, Misher financed the stock on Mainland and connected to many other Mafia and C.I.A. people. Bath also owned an airplane company called Skyways Aircraft Leasing that was incorporated in the Cayman Islands. And when you research the incorporators of this company, the people that started it up, you find it was the same people that started up a company called IC. It became Intel Cooperation that was in the middle of Oliver North's money laundering for the Contras. And no investigator, either with the Tower Commission or the congressional investigators, ever went down to the Cayman Islands or ever tried to find out who these people were.
This program is distributed by the Pacifica Radio Archive. For information about obtaining a cassette copy, call the Pacifica Radio Archive at 800-735-0230. That's 800-735-0230, the Pacifica Radio Archive.
This is Dennis Bernstein, and we're back talking with Pete Brewton, the author of The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush, recently released by SPI and distributed by Hearst. Pete, let's go to another part of the story. We've been talking about the essence, your investigation, the relationship between the CIA, the Mafia, organized crime, if you will, and some of the most powerful politicians and movers and shakers in American corporate life. But there's another story here, and that has to do with the roadblocks and all the hurdles that you had to overcome to gather the material and to actually to get it out into the public eye, both that as a journalist for the Houston Post and then writing first for Simon & Schuster and then ultimately for the publisher that you're with now. So let's start with the Houston Post. I understand that you had a real struggle getting some of the information out. I imagine some of the information that had to do with Walter Mischer. I remember when I first interviewed you, I brought up the subject of Walter Mischer, and you went from a very talkative man to a very silent person. Now, I know that in part that was because you were in the middle of the investigation. I also imagine it was because you couldn't get those stories into your own paper. You want to talk about the struggle you had at the Houston Post?
Sure. And the struggle began way before Walter Mischer. It began at the initial stories that Greg C. and I wrote for the Houston Post about Mainland Savings and some Mafia involvement in Mainland Savings. I encountered some resistance from the Post attorneys. The Post law firm that they used to read stories for libel considerations is Fulbright and Jaworski, which is one of the major law firms in this country. Jaworski, of course, was the Leon Jaworski, Watergate prosecutor, a very famous man. Fulbright Jaworski is a very powerful law firm, and they are the Houston Post lawyers. And the stories that we wrote for Mainland Savings, the lawyers at Fulbright Jaworski would read those for libel considerations, and they put up some resistance to some of those. One in particular was about one of these New York money brokers that were involved with Mainland Savings. Greg and I had gone up to New York City. We found that Martin Schwimmer, who was Mario Renda's partner in brokering money all over the United States, the savings and loans. They would collect, collect money from credit unions and pension funds and distribute that and invest it, broker it into savings and loans across the country. And in exchange, they would usually require these S&Ls to make loans to their partners. And the first place they got caught was in Kansas City, in the case we talked about, Indian Springs State Bank.
And that was with Farhad Azim and the
Right.
get out of jail free card
Right.
and the CIA. And Mario Renda, just to remind people, is the sort of the mob figure who seized on deregulation and even before deregulation to use these S&Ls as his own cash cows, brokers really using broker deposits and kickbacks from those deposits.
That's correct. And he was indicted and later convicted on a scheme that involved mainland savings. They were brokering union pension funds into mainland savings. And the prosecutors in Brooklyn that were going after Renda and Schwimmer, said that they had almost always and found that their deposits were linked to loans. In other words, when Renda and Schwimmer put money in an S&L, they would require that the S&L then make loans to their associates.
Just very briefly say what the broker deposit is.
It's just what I said. They would collect money from credit unions and pension funds and bundle it into $100,000 packages so it was covered by deposit insurance, and then they would basically buy a CD at a savings loan or put that money into a savings loan, and the S&L would then use that money to make loans. I mean, that's where they got a lot of their money.
And they would require that those loans be made to people who they wanted those loans to be made
That's
to.
correct. Now, one of Renda's associates was Adnan Khashoggi, who got a huge $68 million loan, from mainland savings. And here Renda is brokering money in. Well, we didn't know that at the time. Well, we just knew Renda and Schwimmer, and they were tied to the Mafia. And we wondered if there were any loans connected to Mario Renda and Martin Schwimmer's deposits in the mainland. Well, the first rattle out of the box, the first people we were investigating were these New York apartment syndicators who had taken some $100 million out of mainland. And so here they were from New York, Renda Schwimmer from New York. We thought maybe this was the connection. Maybe there was a link. So we went up to Long Island, to New York City, and to investigate these people. And the head of the apartment syndication group was a man named Howard Pulver. So we went to see him. We finally found him. It took us some while to actually find out where he lived. He lived in Kings Point, Long Island, which was a very ritzy suburb on the north shore of Long Island. And Pulver lived in a house that was secluded. You couldn't see it from the road. He had a no trespassing sign at the front of the road leading to his house. And the name on the mailbox in front of on the road was someone who hadn't lived there in 13 years. And here we come to this huge mansion. It's got a glass dome over an indoor swimming pool, a pond out in front, big cars and motorhomes in the parking lot. And we went to talk to Pulver. He gave us 10 seconds to get off his property. So we're investigating, trying to look at the public documents, trying to find any connection between Pulver and Renda. I mean, Pulver had a partner named Tony Padone. So we're looking at connections between Padone and Renda. Couldn't find anything. So then we said, well, let's look at Martin Schwimmer. Let's go talk to him. Schwimmer had been laundering money for the Lucchese Mafia crime family. And he was a PhD author. So we find out he lived in Kings Point too. So we're driving up trying to find Schwimmer's house. We find the street he lives on. We're driving down the street. We're almost there at his house. And we look on the left. We see the back of this huge mansion with a glass dome over it. It's Howard Pulver's house. They're neighbors. They live close to each other in this very secluded area of Kings Point, Long Island. And, we knew we had something there. Here we have Schwimmer brokering maybe $100 million into mainland savings, and his Kings Point neighbor taking maybe $100 million out of mainland savings. Okay, so we knew that there was likely a connection there. Anyway, Greg and I wrote this big, long story about this, including a lot of background information about Howard Pulver, Mario Renda, and Martin Schwimmer. The attorney at Fulbright Jaworski almost killed that story and got most of the details taken out. I mean, he particularly was defending Howard Pulver. You can't say this about this man, and blah, blah, this and that and the other. It was a very hard just getting the fact in that they were neighbors and had both done business with Mainland Savings. I found out much later that Fulbright Jaworski was representing Howard Pulver's company in a lawsuit at the same time.
I imagine they Mr. Pulver probably got a phone call very quickly.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speculate on that, but there was a conflict of interest there. Okay. Then, when I started the C.I.A. stories, they were basically finished in the fall of 1989 and should have run in 1989. And the reason they didn't was because Fulbright Jaworski was protesting and giving us a lot of trouble and saying we couldn't run the stories, particularly on Walter Mischer. I mean, they were trying to make us, they given the argument that Mischer wasn't a public figure, which was absolutely nonsense, and trying to keep the Mischer stuff out. And when we started running the stories eventually in February of 1990, we should have run the Mischer stories first, because that's where it makes sense. It all hinges on Mischer. I mean, you can tie everything that you look at back to Mischer and his circle of powerful Houston businessmen and politicians. And without Mischer, it's hard to make sense out of a lot of this, because he's the key. He's the key middleman. And they didn't run Mischer because of what Fulbright Jaworski was, telling them about it.
Now, what was the attitude of your editors? Were they just accepting this because it didn't sound like it was illegal. They weren't making a legal justification for not running the stories. It was more of a personal and a philosophical.
Well, they were saying that they would not sign off on the stories on Mischer, saying that there were libel problems. So our editors were saying, well, let's go ahead and run this other stuff. We can do that later. So we began running. We had stuff on Corson and Azima and Palmer National Bank, and it was sort of spread out, run sporadically, rather than as a series, which I protested. I wanted to run it, every day. Let's hit them every day with something new. And as a result of just doing it sporadically, we came in for a lot of criticism because the first two stories we ran were very weak and were only intended to be run as an introduction to the series, along with another major story that on a Sunday, then there would be another story on Monday, then another one on Tuesday. And as a result, we got a lot of criticism because people just read the first two stories and said, "There's nothing here. There's no details. There's no backup evidence." And so finally, we got all the stories out by the fall of 1990, and I went back to working on the Mischer stuff to try to get it in. And we had some more corroborating evidence. We had, the stories were good. I wrote them. We had a sit-down meeting with Fulbright and Jaworski. They protested again. I answered their objections. The editors said they were going to run the stories. Okay. Finally, though, it came Christmas time, and we were going to run them on December 31st. I was at my parents' ranch at the time, not in Houston, and Fulbright Jaworski lawyers basically would not sign off on the story, and the top editor, who was new, went along with that rather than overrule them. Now, go back to the beginning.
So the lawyers here are becoming the executive editor,
Right.
making the final decision.
That's right. You go back to the beginning when Fulbright and Jaworski first read the Mischer stories back in the fall of '89. We had a sit-down meeting with the junior associate there at Fulbright and Jaworski, and he starts criticizing the stories in very strong language, and not language like he usually uses, a very mild-mannered person. And so, it started ringing bell, it set off alarms with me. And I said, I asked him immediately, does Fulbright Jaworski have any conflicts of interest with these stories? Because something else was going on. It wasn't normal behavior, regardless of what the content of the story was. He just did not act that way. And he said not that he knows of, and that they had done work for M-Bank, and M-Bank was, of course, financing a lot of Herman K. Beebe's stuff, but that M-Bank no longer existed and had been taken over by another bank, and so he didn't think they had any conflicts of interest. Well, they did. They had big-time conflicts of interest. And he either did not check on it like he had a duty to check, particularly when I asked him. And if he'd checked, he'd found that they were representing Walter Mischer's company in a wrongful death suit. At the same time, they were killing Walter Mischer stories at the Houston Post. They had represented Walter Mischer's company previously in a lawsuit, and I found out recently, if you call out Fulbright and Jaworski and you ask to speak to the attorney who handles Walter Mischer's interests, you're referred to an attorney in their San Antonio office who coordinates litigation for a Mischer company there. So they had conflicts of interest, and they either didn't research it, and if they did, they didn't tell us about it.
Okay, share what, you must have been pretty angry at this point.
I was furious.
Could you share, what was the dialogue? Did you go and bring this to your editors?
Well, what happened was when I was told, around New Year's Day, or shortly before that Fulbright and Jaworski would not sign off on the stories, and that they weren't going to run them, I exploded, and I said, I bet this attorney, who was a junior associate at the time, his job is on the line. If he can't stop these stories, he won't make partner at Fulbright and Jaworski. Well, 6 weeks later, I'd taken a leave. After they didn't run the stories, I took a leave of absence to write the book. 6 weeks later, I was sitting in a restaurant with two of the top editors of the Post, and one of them told me, "Hey, guess what? This junior associate we're talking about just got made a partner at Fulbright and Jaworski." So that's when I started looking in depth at Fulbright and Jaworski for conflicts of interest. I found a lot more. Fulbright and Jaworski's Washington office represented Palmer National Bank and a securities offering.
This is the bank that was started.
Financed by Herman K. Beebe, tied in with intelligence operations.
Spitz Channel, Contras.
Right. And here they were, Fulbright and Jaworski is representing them. A number of other conflicts of interest I found. Fulbright and Jaworski, through the M.D. Anderson Foundation, had laundered money for the C.I.A. They had been involved in a land deal involving Herman K. Beebe. A number of others. So I took all this information to the Houston Post editors and told them about it. I thought that they needed to know this, what I'd found out, and I shouldn't just sit on this information. Well, guess what the Houston Post did when I told them about it? Nothing. Apparently they questioned one of the lawyers about it. He gave them some legal mumbo jumbo that turned out not to be accurate, and they were apparently satisfied with that and continue to use Fulbright and Jaworski. And that was one of the reasons I did not go back to the Houston Post, because anything I wrote would have to go through Fulbright and Jaworski.
Did you ask your editors, or did you ask them about how this might compromise the nature of freedom of the press, the open flow of information? Did you get into this dialogue at all? Or?
Not much. But I mean, I probably would have said, we've just turned this newspaper over to Fulbright and Jaworski, you just don't. They didn't respond to it.
Why were they so willing? Why wouldn't they change law firms? Why were they so? Was this the only law firm in town? Why did they need this law firm?
It's a fairly long story. I'm not sure it's particularly relevant. I mean, the Hobby family in Houston used to own the Houston Post. Ovida Culp Hobby was a very influential woman in Houston. She had been in FDR's cabinet She had married a Texas governor, William P. Hobby. Her son became the lieutenant governor of Texas and was lieutenant governor for many years, Bill Hobby. And in 1983, I believe, they sold the Houston Post to a group of Canadians. It had the Toronto Sun. Really interesting and good people. We had a lot of fun working for the Canadians. And when the Hobby family left, one of their people told the Canadians that they should get Fulbright and Jaworski for their lawyers. And the Canadians hired them on their recommendation. And when William Dean Singleton bought the Houston Post from the Canadians, he kept Fulbright and Jaworski on. Fulbright and Jaworski is a very influential, powerful firm, and they can protect you from a lot of things. And I think that the Post liked to have that protection. I mean, there were some times where,
given that it really did, it was demonstrated here that the law firm was acting not in the best interests of the paper or the people who read the paper, but just on their own conflict of interest. I mean, didn't
Yes.
that concern them that this might be a problem in the future?
I got no sense that concerned them very much. And as I say, that's one of the reasons I didn't go back there.
Besides turning it over to the law firm, what just a little bit on a more philosophical level, what does that mean for freedom of speech, freedom of the press? What does that mean?
Well, it's just, it's terrible. I mean, the lawyers become the ultimate editors rather than journalists. And lawyers have entirely different ways of thinking about things, entirely different motives, entirely different ends than journalists do. I mean, our function is to get information out to the public. Lawyers' functions is sort of to handle disputes between people. And our society is not delegated editing functions to lawyers, but it's now come to that.
I have to ask you one. I just have to ask you to speculate with me on one other thing, or maybe just reflect on it. Now, Leon Jaworski was called in after the Saturday Night Massacre, in which Richard Nixon had Archibald Cox fired.
Correct.
And we remember that Elliot Richardson resigned in protest, refusing to fire Cox, and then there was another one who refused to do it, and then finally it went to Solicitor General Robert Bork, who did fire Archibald Cox.
Yes.
And Leon Jaworski came in,
Yes.
and there was a real limiting of the investigation.
Yes.
And I have to wonder why they went to Jaworski.
Well, I wonder too. And Jaworski obviously had to know about the M.D. Anderson Foundation laundering money for the C.I.A. Fulbright Jaworski ran the M.D. Anderson Foundation. So he was probably involved, without doubt, in laundering money for the CIA, helping them. By the way, the Hobby Foundation the Hobby family had a foundation that was also doing the same money laundering for the CIA. And I had people tell me that they believe that Jaworski had other connections to the CIA. In other words, he represented them in legal matters. And so here we have the same old story. Someone tied into the CIA being brought in to head or lead an investigation that touches on the CIA. And the CIA never got really tied in to Watergate.
And it was interesting that there seemed to be a sort of agreement, we'll let Nixon go, but we're not going to get into the nature of the illegal bombings of Cambodia and other related CIA dirty tricks that ultimately were revealed to some degree by Church and
correct.
Pike.
Yes.
And it took many more years to get to them.
Well, and Nixon, you remember, tried to threaten the CIA to get them to call off the FBI investigation. And you remember one of the things he threatened them with, he says, this whole Howard Hunt Cuban thing could come out. And there was a lot of speculation, and still is, about what exactly does he mean by that. And some people think he was talking about the CIA hiring the Mafia to kill Castro. And, if that came out, I mean, that's something that just is outrageous. I mean, the agency of this government hiring organized criminals to do things. And of course, that came out during the church committee.
And these names came up again in your book
Yes,
with
that's right.
Santos Trafficante.
That's right.
I mean, it's the same.
Frank Sturgis and some of these people.
All right. Now, that wasn't the only roadblock. So there you were, leaving the Houston Post to write a book. You were called to New York. You were solicited by the president of Simon & Schuster. By the way, this brings us back to Watergate and part of that story. It's sort of one big story here. And you were called in. I guess they saw some of the articles that were being published in the Post, and they had some interest in you writing a book based on these articles.
Yes. The way it happened, I'm not sure if it, you can read anything into it, but one of their editors called me and said his father had told him about some of my stories that had appeared in a California alternative newspaper, and he wondered if I could send them to him. So I did. This was the summer of 1990, and we were right in the middle of the story. I think I'd just written the Palmer National Bank story. And I sent them to him. He got back to me and said he'd shown them to their top people, including Alice Mayhew, who was one of their top editors and had edited All the President's Men by Woodward and Bernstein, and done a number of best-selling books. And they wanted to talk to me, so they flew me up to New York City. We had a very nice visit, and I told them basically what I was doing, and I had not given much thought to writing a book. And they had actually solicited me. I didn't have an agent or anything like that. And the next day, Alice Mayhew called me up and said, "We'd like to make you an offer. We'd like to, sign you up on a contract to write a book for us, and we'll pay you $100,000 advance." And my attitude was, where do I sign? I mean, and the main reason was that here was one of the top editors, considered top editors in the country. Also, I must say, going into this, I knew about the corporate background of Simon & Schuster. The fact that Simon & Schuster was owned and is owned by Paramount Communications. Paramount Communications was the former Gulf and Western, the big conglomerate. That one of the founders was a Houston man named John Duncan. And John Duncan's brother is Charles Duncan, who was the Secretary of Energy, I believe, under Jimmy Carter, a former Associate Secretary of the Defense Department. And these people tie in to the Misher circle very closely. Okay? They're connected to Jack Trotter, who was Mischer's very close associate and involved in lots of investments. And one of the board members of Paramount Communications is Hugh Ledke, who is the chairman board of Pennzoil and one of George Bush's closest friends and longtime business associates. They had Zapata Petroleum together back in the 50s. And so I knew this going in, and I thought it would just be really poetic justice for Simon & Schuster to do this book. And it turned out to be too good to be true, because Simon & Schuster eventually refused to publish the book before the election.
How did that unfold? I mean, here's a publisher that offers you $100,000 advance. Usually it goes. I imagine you got $50,000
Yes.
right away, so you had $50,000 in your pocket.
Yes.
They had gone $50,000 in the red for this book, plus all the time they spent in terms of editors and working back and forth at that level. So how did you find out they didn't want to publish your book?
Well, the manuscript was due in the summer of '91, and I sent it in on the deadline date, and about 2 months later, I get a 4-page editing letter from Alice Mayhew saying that it's great material, it's wonderful, in fact it's even overwhelming, and we think it needs to be restructured or reorganized because it's too hard to understand the way you've got it structured now, and she suggested a way to organize it that I didn't particularly care for, although I saw a similar way to do it. And so I wrote her back, and I said, well, let me suggest an alternative way to do it. And she agreed and wrote me a letter back, wonderful, great. She even said, we think you've proved what you set out to prove in tracing the lineage of the S&L debacle back to the Mafia and the CIA. And she said, but we think you've done it uneconomically, and the way you suggested, we think will do it. Well, I started working on that, and it didn't work. And I had to do another different type of organization I think works better now. And that took another couple of months. And during this time, I'm in contact with one of Alice Mayhew's associates. And by the way, when I was negotiating the contract with Simon Schuster, I wrote them in writing, and I said to them that this book has to come out before the 1992 presidential election because it's got all this stuff on Bush and on Lloyd Bentsen. And at that time, there was lots of talk about Bentsen being the Democratic nominee. And they agreed to move up their normal lead time of 18 months to 12 months. So the book can be published in the summer of '92. All right. Now, during this time, when I sent them the manuscript, I reminded them this. In the summer of '91, I said, look, as you can see, this book needs to go, and we talked about it needs to go for the presidential election. When I'm doing the restructuring, I contact Alice's assistant, and I'm concerned. I said, I'm concerned that this book be published before the election. I want to make sure we got enough time. And he said, don't worry, we can put it out in 2 months when we get the revised manuscript. He says, no problem. So in February, I submitted the revised manuscript, and I don't hear anything from him, nothing. In the meantime, I've been talking to Steve Pizzo, and he tells me there's this thing called the fall list that publishers have that they're going to publish in the second half of the year. And if you're not on that, you're not going to get published. So I wanted to make sure, and he said publishers are drawing this list up right now. So I wanted to make sure I was on the list, and I called Alice, and I sent her letters and faxes, and I got no response. And I talked to her assistant, and I said, did you get the manuscript? He said, and he just kind of brushed, oh yeah, I got it, and I'll read it when I get around to it. Just kind of blew it off. And I knew their attitude had changed for some reason, and no apparent reason, that their attitude toward the book had changed. So I couldn't get a hold of it. I couldn't get a hold of Alice. And finally, I called her secretary. I said, I'm coming up there on March the 18th. Make an appointment, put it in her appointment book. I'm going to fly up at my own expense to talk to her. Well, 2 days before that, Alice sends me a fax saying, we're going to have to postpone our meeting until next week. I'm real busy. Hope that's okay. So I called up her secretary immediately, and that's when she put Alice on the phone. And I said, hey, this book needs to go for the presidential election. We got to get moved. And she said, there's no way, we don't have time. I'm not going to crash this book, which means put it on a crash program to publish it early. And I argued with her. It's got all this stuff about George Bush that the American public needs to know. And her reply was, quote, George Bush is going to win anyway, close quote. And then...
When was this? When did this
This is in March of this year. George Bush is going to win anyway. And then another thing she said when I was arguing about it, she said, quote, nobody reads anything in September and October, close quote. Now, I don't know what's going on in her mind, what her motives were, whether she really believed this. I'm telling you, that's what she said to me to try to give a reason why they weren't going to publish this book before the election. And that's when I made the decision, I'm getting out, I'm finding another publisher. There were some other problems. Simon Schuster eventually ended up breaching the contract, and so that gave me an out, and I terminated the contract and went to Sapolsky. And Sapolsky has just been wonderful in getting this book out for the election.
And they're publishing it in their sort of one of their sub SPIs.
SPI is an affiliate of Sapolsky Publishers, right. Yes.
And the book is coming out on SPI, and it's being distributed by Hearst.
That's correct.
And that's the book we're talking about right now is George Bush, the Mafia, and the CIA. No? What are we talking about here?
Close.
George Bush, the CIA, and the Mafia. And we're speaking with Pete Brewton, and we're talking about the struggle to get the book out. And I guess I want to ask you, did you want to add something to that? Okay. Is there something?
The titles.
Okay, I want to ask you this, Pete. This is the final question. You talked about roadblocks in terms of the Houston Post. You talked about roadblocks in terms of publishing it. And by the way, on the cover of the book, it's listed. This is the book that Simon & Schuster wouldn't publish. So look for that little gold star. What other risks were there? You were publishing material about very dangerous people who are known not to let human life stand in the way of their own economic progress. Were there any threats to your life? Were there any times when you felt that your life was in danger? Was this a risk? I mean, going up there on Long Island and approaching, talking to sort of mob-related people who are standing there looking at you very angrily, barefooted?
Well, the mob is supposed to have the unwritten code that they don't mess with policemen, judges, and journalists. They've stepped over the line on that a number of occasions. But I think I kind of snuck up on them, and they weren't really expecting anything. And by the time that I'd done it, it was too late for them to do anything to stop it. And doing anything to me would just give them more negative publicity. I mean, bring more spotlight on them. And that's the whole reason they're supposed to leave journalists alone. I mean, journalists can just give them bad publicity. We can't convene a grand jury and indict them and then serve as judge and jury and put them in jail. We could just write information about them. And the people they really, are in danger from the Mafia are their business competitors and witnesses against them. Those are the ones they like to kill. So it's too late now, really. And
were any of your sources ever in danger
yes.
while you were talking to them?
I'm sure they were. Nothing so far has happened to any of them. It's like I said, I think they always thought that none of this information would really get out, and they were wrong.
Pete Brewton, perhaps the most significant, expensive, comprehensive SNL Mafia C.I.A. ripoff has to do with a particular Florida land deal, which seems to include a cast of thousands, or at least dozens. We're talking about, we have Walter Mischel back for another show. We have Robert Corson, the CIA mule, who owned Vision Bank. We have the St. Joe Paper Company. We have DuPont people in here. We have Billie Jean Garman, who's Corson's mother or stepmother. Mother. And this goes on and on and on. So we want to talk about this, and we want to be very specific about who the people are. And this includes some of the key CIA people. It includes offshore banking, and so on and so forth. It's a complicated affair, but it's a very important, very expensive one to taxpayers. So why don't you give us an overview on exactly what happened, and then we can get into who some of the players are.
Okay. In 1986, the St. Joe Paper Company, which is the largest landowner in Florida, and it is owned by the Alfred I. DuPont Testamentary Trust, which is a DuPont entity. And the St. Joe Paper Company, in the largest sale of raw land in Florida history, sold 21,000 acres for $200 million to a two-bit Houston home builder named Mike Atkinson. And to understand this deal, you have to go back to another deal, earlier deal in Houston. Atkinson had come to Houston in the late 70s, was a little home builder, and had met a woman from Kuwait, who introduced him to some big Kuwaiti and Saudi businessmen, and flew Atkinson over to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and he gets involved with these people and is representing some of their interests in investing their money, settling the things in Houston. Now, this apparently got him involved with some really big shots like Walter Mischer. Walter Mischer shows up on his financial statement in 1983 as a reference. He also began to do weapons deals at this time into the Middle East, into Iran and Iraq and Kuwait. The first big land deal that Atkinson did was he bought Meyerland Shopping Center in Houston. It's an old, well-respected shopping center in the middle of a well-respected, venerable Jewish community in southwest Houston. This is owned by the Meyer family. It's not a modern shopping center. It's not totally enclosed, but it's in a very good location on the southwest loop in Houston. The shopping center was worth probably about $25 million. The matriarch of the Meyer family is Leota Meyer Hess. She said the next generation, the second generation, her children and nieces and nephews and their children wanted to sell the shopping center and get their money. There was a $4 million mortgage on it. So, you take that off and it's to them about $21 million they would get. And Mrs. Hess did not want to sell. And she said, well, I'll only sell if we get $35 million for it. No one would pay $35 million for it. All the people that do shopping centers and invest in that kind of thing would only go like $25 million. And one day, Miss Hess is going downtown to see her attorneys, Fulbright and Jaworski, when she meets her old friend, Walter Mischer. And Misher starts asking her about the shopping center and tells her she ought to sell it. She's got no business running that, she ought to sell it. Well, a couple of weeks later, Mike Atkinson appears in Mrs. Hess's office with his attorney saying they want to buy the shopping center and that Walter Mischer had sent them. And they were going to pay $35 million. And Miss Hess did not like Atkinson and Collins. She knew the center was not worth $35 million. They didn't ask to see her financial statements or the leases or anything. They didn't ask any questions. They just wanted to buy the shopping center. And so, but her relatives, the next generation, wanted their money, and now they'd get $10 million more. They'd get $30 million in cash for a shopping center that's worth $25. And so they sold. Now, the same day Atkinson when he buys the shopping center, he buys it in the name of a company in the Isle of Jersey, which is a tax haven island in the English Channel between England and France that people go to hide and keep their money from taxes. And the company's name was Barbados, and it was supposed to be representing some of Atkinson's Arabian partners. Well, he buys it in the name of Barbados for $35 million, flips it the same day to his company for $70 million. And then the money to finance all of this came from Lamar Savings.
What do you mean flips it?
Just sold it immediately. Sold it to me, no added value. He just doubled the price on paper. For there's no economic reason just to jack up the price. The money to finance the transaction came from Lamar Savings in Austin. Lamar Savings was the same S&L that had been involved with Adnan Khashoggi. They had taken special interest rate deals with Mario Renda and other questionable dealings. And what happened, they funded $47 million cash, but the mortgage for the $47 million was just half of the shopping center. And there were some other properties involved as well as the surrounding properties. So essentially what Atkinson had done is had taken a shopping center that was worth $25 million and in one day jacked up its apparent value to $100 million. Okay, and the money came from a savings and loan. Barbados, this Isle of Jersey company, made an instant cash profit of $10 million for doing nothing. Absolutely nothing. $10 million goes to the Isle of Jersey, to these supposed Arabs. Eventually, some $30 million would go to the Isle of Jersey from the Meyerland deal. By the way, Walter Mischer's bank kicked in $5 million that went to the Isle of Jersey. Herman K. Beebe's Continental Savings, $20 million. San Jacinto Savings, which was involved in a deal with Herman Beebe, Allied Bank, and Continental in an earlier deal, kicked in $5 million. Another fraud-riddled S&L called Delta Savings kicked in a little over $5 million. All of this goes to the Isle of Jersey. All right. That's the preliminary to the Florida land deal, because the next year, Atkinson goes to Florida, meets with Jake Beeland, who headed the St. Joe Paper Company for the DuPonts, and they decide to sell him the 21,000 acres for $200 million. Every expert that's ever been questioned about that deal said it was totally ridiculous, that it wasn't worth that money, and the development plans were just not there. It was obviously either stupid or a scam. Now, they ended up, when they consummated the deal, a company called Panhandle Coast Investments ended up making a sales contract with St. Joe Paper Company, and then they were going to flip it to Atkinson. And the whole idea was to create a $20 million profit that Atkinson would allegedly owe the Isle of Jersey, so they could get the money off the Isle of Jersey. That's the way they did. They would create fake promissory notes that Atkinson would sign. I owe you, Isle of Jersey Company, $20 million. And there would be no value. I mean, they had not paid him $20 million. It was all bogus. But since it was on the Isle of Jersey, you couldn't get to that to prove that it was bogus. And then you just send $20 million to the Isle of Jersey, and they cancel the IOU, and nobody's the wiser. They did that with Meyerland, and they did it with the St. Joe Paper Company deal. And so the person that set up Panhandle Coast Investments, allegedly to front this deal for the Arabs in Atkinson, was a Miami attorney named Lawrence Freeman. And Lawrence Freeman has a long, colorful history with C.I.A. and Mafia people. Lawrence Freeman was a money launderer for Santo Trafficante, the mob boss of Florida, and he was the law partner of Paul Hellawell, one of the original founders of the CIA, one of the top operatives and agents for the CIA.
Who had a lot to do with the inventing of sort of offshore banking, money laundering,
yes.
Moving, working with negotiable instruments.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. Hellawell started Castle Bank and Trust with a Chicago attorney named Burton Cantor, who represented some mob interests. And Castle Bank and Trust was in the Cayman Islands and laundered money for the mob and the CIA. Freeman was hired by Hellawell's company and then became the in-house counsel to Castle Bank and Trust, and then left to start his own practice where he was laundering money for Mafia people and CIA people. He's brought in to front this deal. After his company signs the sales contract, then he assigns his interest to Atkinson, and then a month later, he is indicted for laundering drug money for a man named Jack DeVoe, who turns out to have connections to the CIA. Okay, they do the deal. The money comes, $80 million comes from Hill Financial Savings in Red Hill, Pennsylvania, which has done other deals with $200 million worth of deals with Richard Rossmiller, the Denver man connected to Herman K. Beebe, has done deals with Mainland Savings and a Detroit Mafia associate that was dealing with Mainland, has done other deals with Vernon Savings and Delta Savings. They're brought in to do the main financing. They need $20 million more. That comes from Robert Corson's Vision Bank Savings. And that basically ended up busting Vision Bank Savings. The bulk of the money, almost $70 million in cash, went to St. Joe Paper Company.
Could you just remind people with a few details who Robert Corson is?
Robert Corson is the CIA mule and Walter Mischer's former son-in-law. He was in business with Richard Brennick. He was associated with John Riddle and Mike Atkinson. So Atkinson then of course, defaults on the loan. I mean, he was supposed to develop, Atkinson was supposed to have all these grandiose development plans for the 21,000 acres. He doesn't pay off the loan to Hill Financial. St. Joe Paper Company forecloses on the deed. They take back the best 1,800 shoreline acres, and they also got almost $70 million in cash. They really they came out way ahead. They were the big beneficiaries of this land deal. Another probably $7 or $8 million went to the Isle of Jersey, the same company that got the money out of Meyerland, and the same companies that Lawrence Freeman was using to launder Jack DeVoe's drug money, and the same companies John Dick, the Denver businessman tied into the Silverado crowd, was using for his business interests. I mean, these same Isle of Jersey companies were doing all this at the same time. And we found out later that there were some invoices in the money, the $30 million or so that went to the Isle of Jersey. It looked like $10 million of that was used to buy Volvo trucks for Kuwait. The thing is that the Kuwaiti company would not have needed to use Mike Atkinson to buy $10 million of Volvo trucks. I mean, they could just go to their bank or pay cash. We found out later that in the BCCI scandal, that invoices for lift trucks were used as a secret code word for missiles, weapons. And in the investigation of the B&L scandal in the Atlanta bank branch of this Italian bank that got the guarantees from the U.S. Government to make loans to Iraq that they then apparently used to buy weapons, that one of the code words for Scud missile launchers were Volvo trucks.
Now, these so-called Volvo trucks that were missiles or missile launchers were going to Kuwait?
Going to Iraq.
Going to Iraq.
Yes. And it's so far it's circumstantial evidence, but it's very strong. I mean, it's the kind of thing that a prosecutor would want to jump on immediately, and nobody has. I mean, Atkinson got convicted, sentenced to 11 years in jail. With a good time, he'll be out in 3, and he's got millions salted offshore. So he's not in. He doesn't have to talk. Corson will probably cop a plea, and he may go to trial. I don't know. He won't get. He'll get slapped on the wrist, do a few years, and be out. There's no incentive for these people to talk and tell what happened.
When would these missiles have gone to Iraq?
It was in 86. Even maybe earlier than that, 85, 86. This is a time, where Iran and Iraq are having this huge war, and the United States is basically supplying both sides. I mean, we wanted them basically to kill each other off or maintain the balance of terror, and we could supply both sides with weapons, and everybody makes out. Of course, we know that Scud missile launchers were later used on American troops during the Gulf War.
So this is another possible aspect of Iraqgate.
Yes.
In which transfers are happening through the B&L Bank. And this is a situation, I can't help remembering we're talking about your book, The Mafia, the C.I.A. and George Bush, and people who have looked at Iraqgate know that George Bush played an extensive role personally and with his administration in facilitating these loans for Iraq. Essentially what it came down to is George Bush made these weapons available. He made it possible for Iraq to buy them with U.S.-backed tax dollars, and then he attempted to cover it up. So is there any connection here between the administration turning a blind eye, or?
I don't know. We don't know yet. I think that bears investigation.
So what else do we need to know about this? So is Walter Mischer liable in any way for this?
Well,
are the DuPonts worth investigating on this?
Yeah. The question is, what did they know? Were they just innocent dupes, that allowed their land, they made out like bandits. I mean, and the money they got was used to build up St. Joe Paper Company, to expand their paper mill, to buy, long-term investments and CDs. That's taxpayers, it's our money. That's what it went for. Now, were they innocent dupes, or were they part of it? There are other connections, CIA connections to the DuPonts. We know that. They had to know they were getting more money than the land was worth. We don't know. I mean, the prosecutors have not gone after St. Joe Paper Company and the people there that were involved in this deal.
And to this day, St. Joe is just doing fine.
Oh, yes. And they're most of that, they are owned by a testamentary trust whose beneficiary is the Nemours Foundation that runs hospitals for crippled children. That's the one supposed to get the money, but of the $70 million, only $2 or $3 million was eventually funneled on through the foundation. All of it, almost all of it, was kept within the company.
All right. Thank you, Pete Brewton. We've been talking about the Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush, and we wish you the best of luck on your endeavors.
Thank you.
We're talking with Pete Brewton, the author of The Mafia, the CIA, and George Bush, just out on SPI Press, distributed by Hearst. Look for it in your bookshelves. It's worth a read. This is Dennis Bernstein, and I am here with Susan Burns.
Pete, Will Northrop, an Israeli military intelligence officer and CIA asset, said once, and this is in your book, "You don't know where the CIA stops and where the Republicans start." What do you think he meant by that?
I think when Jimmy Carter was president, he brought in Stansfield Turner as the CIA director, and the idea, they wanted to start a clean house. This was after the Church Committee hearings, where all the stuff about the CIA's, operations and illegal domestic surveillance, assassination of foreign leaders. I mean, people wanted the CIA cleaned up. And, Stansfield Turner came in, I think they had what they call the Halloween massacre, when he got rid of a number of covert operators, including people like Ted Shackley and Thomas Clines. They were involved with Ed Wilson, the renegade CIA agent. And these people went, quote, off the reservation. But they sort of continued to do, covert operations, and many of them worked in the Bush-Reagan campaign against Jimmy Carter. And when Reagan took over, these people sort of continued to do, a lot of them weren't brought back in, but they continued to do covert operations. And Corson continued to do this also. And I think, he's talking about that the Republicans, that these CIA renegades were really working for the Republicans to get rid of Carter and to continue a lot of the foreign and domestic operations that were supporting a lot of the right-wing businessmen in this country. And so I think that's what he's talking about. It was when Reagan Bush came in, then all of a sudden Corson's stock goes up. And, and he said, you just can't tell. They're all Republicans, and they all got involved in these covert operations.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that if Clinton gets elected, will the power structure be different? Will Clinton go along with what's been happening over the past 12 years?
I think that's a big question that hasn't been asked and needs to be asked, and reporters should be trying to find out if Misher et al. have wormed into the Clinton-Gore campaign. These people do not like to take chances. They don't like to gamble politically. They like to cover their bets. They want to make sure that regardless of who wins, they have an in, and that whoever wins is going to let them operate like they've always been operating. And so, a real big question is, who is doing that in the Clinton-Gore campaign? Who is their front man? How have they insinuated themselves? Are they doing it with hard money? Are they doing it with soft money? Because they're doing it. Now, back in the early spring of this year, when Clinton was having problems, we weren't sure what was going to happen with the Democrats. Clinton said that if he has to back out or withdraw for any reason, he's throwing his support behind Lloyd Bentsen, Okay, we know how Lloyd Bentsen is connected to these people. And also I've heard talk that if Clinton wins, that Bentsen is going to get a very high-ranking cabinet position. So it may be Bentsen is the front man for these people. And it's probably the reason also that you may not see the Democrats really publicizing my book, because I didn't want to pull any punches, and I wanted to talk about Lloyd Bentsen also. And I also say, if the Democrats had won in 1988, the title of the book would have been "The Mafia, the CIA, and Lloyd Bentsen," because he and Bush are two interchangeable peas in a pod.
So there seems to be a difference between Clinton and the stance that Jimmy Carter took, or the stance that Kennedy took regarding the CIA.
No one's ever asked Clinton, what is he going to do about the CIA? What is his policy on the CIA? Is he going to get rid of covert operations or tone them down? Like it was set up to be just an intelligence gathering operation. Is he going to expand them? What's his attitude toward the CIA?
There have been a number of articles. Alexander Coburn, great media critic, definitely left of center, has characterized Clinton on foreign policy as being to the right of George Bush, and might be in fact a real supporter of covert action. We know that there was a major operation going on in Mena, Arkansas, which included Barry Seal, the Contras, the drugs, the CIA, and the same old story.
Yes, and that operation, of course, was shut down at the investigation of that operation was shut down at the federal level, and the state police there's some of them working very hard. They've never been able to get too far. Did Bill Clinton know about this? It's a good question.
In your book, you describe many layers of protection between the mafia dealings, the CIA covert actions, the SNL dealings, this whole story. A lot of layers of protection between that information and the public. And how do you think the press has handled this whole SNL situation, and what are some of the reasons for why they've handled it the way that they have?
Generally speaking, is very poorly. There are some exceptions. I think the Dallas Morning News did a pretty good job on the daisy chain of SNLs in Texas connected to Herman K. Beebe. The book Inside Job by Stephen Pizzo, Mary Fricker, and Paul Molo was very good. In nailing down the fraud element, how fraud was the primary cause, and the connections of the politicians. But other than that, the mainstream press, and I'm talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the big TV networks, did not do a good job. And there's a reason for that. It was a very difficult scandal to cover. It wasn't like you could get a press release handed to you on a silver platter. The people inside the Washington Beltway that knew about it were involved with it. They were not going to tell their favorite source. The CIA wasn't going to go to the Washington Post and say, let us tell you about how we were involved in the SNL scandal. So it wasn't like there were any big sources on this. It was bipartisan, so neither party wanted it out. And the records, the documents that reveal the story are either confidential, not public, or they're hidden away in little county courthouses back in the hinterlands of this country. Very difficult to dig out. So the big press reporters that cover big scandals are going to have a hard time doing this kind of scandal.
You, Pete Brewton, you've been criticized in many instances by some members of the mainstream press as pumping up a story that's not really there, unnamed sources, refusing to identify who it is that you're talking to, which law enforcement says this, that, and the other thing. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, they need to read the book. I will agree that the number of stories that came out of the Houston Post were rather short on detail, and I hope we can get into that later. It wasn't because I wanted them to be that way, but I think if you read this book, you're not going to ask, where's the beef? I think this book is very well documented. There are some anonymous sources. I hate anonymous sourcing. I've tried to keep it to a minimum. You cannot do a book about the CIA without using anonymous, or the Mafia without using anonymous sources. People are afraid of these entities, and the people who are in law enforcement that are still in law enforcement are afraid for their jobs if they start talking about this publicly. But I've always tried to have at least 2 or 3 sources on anything I said, and I think the anonymous sourcing on a book like this is really not that much. And not the key stuff, I don't think any of the key stuff is anonymous sources.
A lot of the difficulty I understand in writing a book like this and doing investigations like this is that a lot of the documents are not public information. All the financial documents of these savings and loans and all CIA, or a lot of CIA documents, are not public. And the only people that can make them public is Congress. Congress is supposed to be representing the interests of the American public. And this is a big story. I mean, $500 billion is unaccounted for. Why isn't anybody in Congress asking questions?
That's one of the big number one question on this story is, where did the money go? Who got it? And what was it used for? No one in Congress has ever asked that question. And I don't know of any reporter that has ever asked that question. No one in the Justice Department seems to care. And the only way you can track the money is to look at the documents that came out of the savings, the loan closing documents, the title company disbursement documents. That's how you find out where the money went. And those documents are not public. They're protected by bank secrecy laws, bank confidential information laws. And Congress has the power to make those public. And they should, because this is our money. This is our tax dollars we're talking about. If there had been no taxpayer bailout, then I can see why these documents would be kept secret. But since this was a taxpayer bailout, it's our tax dollars, we deserve to know where the money went. And Congress should open up these records. And no one in Congress has ever brought this up. And if we want to keep this from happening again, the best way to do it is to make these documents public so the crooks know that the public can look at these documents.
You know, it's very interesting. We've been talking a lot about the CIA and how the CIA operates in secrecy. But isn't it true that in many instances it's easier to get documentation about what the CIA does than what happens in the back rooms of banks? Because banks, for instance, have certain loopholes around the Freedom of Information Act.
Well, yes, absolutely. It's the whole idea of banks' involvement in covert operations is something that needs to be explored because of the double layer of secrecy that's there. And the CIA, during the congressional investigation on my stories a couple of years ago, the CIA admitted that 5 of the individuals I'd named in my stories had done work for them, and 4 of the financial institutions they had used, but only for, quote, normal business. Well, the CIA doesn't pick these banks and savings and loans out of a hat. They're the ones that they trust and know are going to help them and not give them any static and that they've used in the past.
Do you think the public will ever really know on a wide scale in normal households, that people will really know what this money was used for and what the CIA is doing?
No, I don't think so. I think it would damage too many people in Washington, D.C. They just can't afford to have that kind of information out. You'd find a lot of it coming back to their own campaign coffers. Mm-hmm. So I really don't think, unless there's people march on Washington, I don't think it's going to happen.
The House Intelligence Committee investigated the connection between the CIA and organized crime and the S&Ls, and I understand that Daniel Childs, the former comptroller of the CIA, became the staff director of that same committee just before the investigation. How is the CIA able to place people like Childs in these positions?
Well, the House Intelligence Committee is basically the lapdog of the CIA, and has been since the Church, in hearings back in the middle 70s. And the CIA basically can control the flow of information to them. I like to say if it had been up to the House Intelligence Committee, the American public would have never known about Iran-Contra, because Oliver North et al. Went up before that committee, and lied to them with impunity, and no one on the committee said or did anything to try to get to the truth. And they did basically the same thing on the CIA investigation. I had began calling the CIA for comment in the late fall of 1989 on my stories. And I had assumed that they were going to run in 1989. They were delayed by basically the Houston Post law firm that I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But the CIA knew that I was working on these stories and were going to run them by the fall of 1989. In January 1990, Daniel Childs comes over as being the chief financial officer of the CIA, who testified before the Iran-Contra committee, who was very close to William Casey, comes over to head the staff of the House Intelligence Committee. He'd also worked on the Senate Intelligence Committee back during the Church Committee investigation days in the middle 70s. 1 month later, 6 weeks later, after he comes to the committee, my stories come out, and the investigation begins. He's basically in charge of it, although he tries to keep a low profile and stay out of the limelight. He's got 3 or 4 attorneys up there that supposedly are doing the investigation. One of them admitted to me they'd never done an investigation like that before. That what they were involved in was, budgetary matters regarding the CIA's budget. Never done an investigation like that before, and Childs can basically manipulate them. They come out and whitewash the whole thing based on, of course, what the CIA tells them. They never did track any of the money. They didn't interview any of the people that I named, I don't believe. I went up there and talked to them, and they just sat there and grimaced at me, and just frowned at me the whole time I was talking to them and telling them who to call and, what to look for. They never tracked any of the money, which was the main thing. Then they come out and say, there's no evidence for any CIA involvement, particularly in connection with any fraud. And even though the CIA says they have these connections to these institutions, individuals, they say it was all on the up and up. And therefore, we shouldn't have a full-blown investigation. All right, they come out with that in the winter of 1990, after my stories had been running all year long. 2 months later, after they finished their investigation, Dan Childs quits the committee, goes back to the CIA as a special assistant to the CIA director. So he's only there for this investigation. I mean, it looks to me like he was specifically brought in for damage control on the SNL investigation.
I believe you've investigated that this is an unusual situation where the CIA comes in and infiltrates. I believe you mentioned in your book that a similar thing happened with the Iran-Contra situation.
Yes, well, I basically got that information from you, Dennis. Tom Polgar was brought in as one of the chief investigators for Iran-Contra committee, and Polgar, of course, was, I believe, a 25-year CIA veteran and headed stations all over the world for the CIA. And he was brought in, and basically he said going in that there was no CIA involvement in Iran-Contra. And of course, we found out now that it was basically a CIA operation, and Oliver North was working for the CIA and is serving as their cutout and front man. Also, it's interesting to note that Polgar is a member or director, advisory director of a company outside Washington, D.C. called Parvis. And Parvis does international intelligence operations for big businesses and international companies. Another advisory director is Richard Helms, former CIA director. I think the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency is on this, director of this company. And the director that really sticks out like a sore thumb, that has no obvious intelligence connections, is an attorney for a Houston law firm The man's name is Theodore Dimitri. He's with Vincent and Elkins, which is one of Walter Mischer's big law firms.
You know, it's interesting when we think about Tom Polgar, and we sort of wonder why he would get the job for the Iran-Contra Committee to investigate CIA dirty tricks. You mentioned that the CIA was involved. Well, there were three station chiefs. There was the Central American Task Force chief. There was the director of the CIA. There was the deputy director of the CIA. And we could go on a long time.
Several more.
We could go on for a very long time about it. I mean, it was a CIA operation, without a doubt. And one wonders why Polgar could get that job. I called up Senator Rudman to ask him, why did you pick Tom Polgar? And the response that I got was, well, he has the experience.
At covering up things, I guess.
I don't know if we're going to use this in the interview, but when Tom Polgar, I did track Tom Polgar's visit to Costa Rica. As you know, there was a man by the name of John Hall, who was the CIA director there, and who was the CIA conduit for the Costa Rican branch of the Contras, the jumping off point. And I attempted to find out what Hall was doing in Costa Rica, and what I found out, what Polgar was doing in Costa Rica, and what I found out was that he was interviewing reporters to find out what they knew, and he never interviewed John Hall.
Well, I probably already knew what John Hall did. John Hall, by the way, shows up in Houston. You know, he met with Oliver North several times in Houston dealing with the Contras, and he would go out to a nightclub and restaurant in West Houston called Catbirds. And he would be drinking with the boys, and including people like Ken Qualls, who was used to be Charles Keating's pilot and worked for C.I.A. Proprietary companies, flying. People like John Riddle were at Catbirds. The reason they were at there because it was owned by Robert Corson. And it was named, the name Catbird was named for Walter Mischer, because Walter Mischer's favorite expression is sitting in the catbird seat.
You might remember there was also a meeting in Houston after the CIA and apparently John Hall, who has been indicted for murder by the Costa Rican government, failed to knock off Eden Pastora, who became unacceptable to the CIA. There was a meeting in Houston in which they discussed what was going to happen and how next they would go after Mr. Pastora.
Could you comment on the Justice Department as another layer of either, failing to protect us, or can I start over?
Sure.
Could you comment on the Justice Department and how have they pursued these kinds of cases?
Well, the Justice Department has gone after the front men and the straw men. And they haven't really put together the big conspiracy investigations that are required. And it's interesting that the people at the Justice Department that were doing this and having great success in the SNL investigations were the organized crime strike forces, because there were mafia involvement and there were these large conspiracies that they were used to dealing with. They were doing quite well. And what happened right in the middle of the SNL debacle in the investigation? The Reagan-Bush administration abolishes the organized crime strike forces, and so they lost all of this. Many of these talented investigators and prosecutors left the Justice Department. So you're left with the U.S. attorneys in each city having responsibility, and you've got these extremely complicated land deals that you have a hard time explaining to a jury. So what the Justice Department a lot of times do, they try to get these people to cop pleas to falsification of a record. Get them, a 5-year jail sentence or something. They'll do 2 and they're out, and go on, chalk it up, and go on to the next one. And they'll do these small little individual investigations, and they're not putting the big picture together. They're not asking who benefited, where did the money go, and so they're getting the front men the mustaches, the beards, the cutouts, and they're not getting the people who were behind it. And I think, that these cutouts in front of me were set up to take the heat, and that's exactly what's happening. And the Justice Department is sort of going along with the program, either willingly or as dupes.
I wonder if you could talk to me sort of as a common U.S. citizen, somebody without any real estate background, without any background in finance, because I know this kind of stuff, this is one of the big problems why it's not more widely known, because it's so complicated. How would you explain it to someone without this kind of background? What's been going on here?
I like to use sort of the black box explanation. Just look at a savings and loan as a black box, and don't even worry about what was going on inside there. Just look at the taxpayers' dollars in the forms of deposit insurance coming in, and then the dollars going out, and that's all. You need to look at our tax dollars coming in, and where do they go, and who gets them. And that's what you have to look at. Where do they go and who gets them? When you start looking at that, you find rich, powerful people with connections to the Mafia and the CIA. Now, I go into detail into the black box in a number of these because sometimes you have to show the criminal involvement and who did what. But it's not necessary to really understand the black box. You just got to know that the way the basic scam worked was the S&Ls would make a loan on a piece of property that was more than the property was worth. Okay? Then the borrower, say there was a piece of property in Houston worth $1 million. The S&L might loan $2 million for some guy to buy that piece of property for $1.5 million. So the landowner has made $500,000. He or she is happy. They're not going to complain. The borrower has made $500,000, and he takes off and defaults on the loan and leaves. So the S&L is stuck. They've loaned out $2 million. They've got a piece of property that's worth $1 million. The United States taxpayers have essentially lost $1 million on that deal. And all the complications come in when everybody tries to jack up the apparent value of this property. There are all sorts of ways you can do it, but that's where all the complications come in, making it look like this property is worth $2 million when it's only worth $1 million. And that's where the loss comes in, the difference between the loan value and the value of the property. And that's a transfer of wealth to the landowner and the borrower. And see, the S&L is going to make profits on it too, so they're getting their cut off the top. The borrower's getting his cut off the top, and the landowner's getting money. And the rest of us are stuck with a bill.
And a deregulation that happened in the early 80s opened the door for this kind of thing. Now, when deregulation was actually took place, what were the proposed benefits to it?
Well, the savings and loans were caught in this so-called interest rate squeeze. The interest rates were going up that they had to pay to attract deposits, yet they had all these long-term mortgage loans that were paying low interest rates. So they were getting caught in this squeeze. Now, I'd like to point out that the savings and loans that stayed with home mortgage lending and didn't get out all this wild speculative stuff survived and made it. So they could have just buttoned down the hatches and ridden it out, and they would have made it. But the deregulation, quote unquote, allowed them to take the money, our tax dollars coming in, basically, depositors that were backed by tax dollars, and lend it out on speculative commercial ventures, raw land, existing buildings. You had all the wild stories about, whorehouses getting, loans on, and Splashtown, one of these water ventures, got a big loan from Robert Corson's savings loan. All the wild stories on what the money was used for. The deregulation allowed the S&Ls to lend on those things rather than just on homes.
And now they're proposing to deregulate banks. Is that right? What do you foresee happening if that happens?
Well, I'm not too sure. fraud basically killed the savings and loans. And fraud is what will kill a financial institution. Very little else will. All of the financial institutions in this country that have been killed and failed have done so basically because of fraud. Now, if that's the only way a bank can go down. I mean, banks, it's like having a printing press. I mean, it's almost impossible to lose unless you start, printing counterfeit money or something. The power structure in this country I don't think is going to shoot themselves in the foot. I mean, these are their banks. It really wasn't their savings and loans. And the banks, they really profited from the S&L debacle. They had a lot of underlying loans on this property that got paid off by the S&Ls. Okay? And they didn't care where the S&Ls went down. So I'm not as concerned about if we have a big bank failures and the taxpayers have to dip into taxpayers' dollars, then, all it means is that these people are basically given up on this country. Because, why is they couldn't care less about S&Ls. The banks are their babies. And the only thing that can kill them is fraud.
But the heads of these banks are participating on an international market. Maybe they don't care about the country.
Well, that's a good, interesting theory. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the banks, to see whether we have any widespread failures like we did in the S&L industry.
The Mafia has existed for a long time. Human greed has existed for a long time. And now it seems that all of this has infiltrated our government. If the press isn't there to protect us, and Congress isn't there to protect us, and the Justice Department isn't there, what is happening to democracy, and how in the world can we turn it around?
Well, it's hard to believe that after I've researched this book, I really don't think that there's democracy in this country. I don't know what it is we've got. Maybe an aristocracy or something like that, but we don't have democracy. The public, the founding fathers knew that the people had to have information to be able to govern themselves. And without that, that's the fundamental thing that distinguishes a democracy from anything else, that the people know what's going on and they can then control their government. And unless we know what's going on, we can't control our government, and we don't have a democracy. And I'm not too optimistic that we're going to get back to that situation. Because the press is become more and more corporate dominated. Big corporations own, the big media outlets. They're not interested in letting the people in on what's going on. Congress isn't interested in letting, that the executive branch is not interested. There are no special interest groups out there fighting to get information to the public. And it's a very pessimistic situation. And, the thing is that if things get too much, out of control, where the people are really being beaten on, and you can see that happening now with the economy. The hundreds of thousands of the manufacturing jobs that we're losing are just, it's sucking the blood marrow of this country. And, that is just ripe for revolution. The people in this country probably can just take so much. And it's not a good situation. And I don't trust the sort of the charitable instincts of our aristocracy to sort of hold back on their greed.
Do you think that this turnover, this supposed turnover that's going to happen in Congress after these elections, is that going to stir anything up, do you think?
Well, I think that's one thing that I really should have said, that there might be some ways to change things, and that's get rid of Congress. Congress is a big problem. That's one thing, Bush is right about that, but he's right for the wrong reasons. Congress is just, they're not protecting the public interest anymore. I mean, they're all dominated by special interests, and they've all got their own little constituency. And that's one way. If we got rid of everybody in Congress, things might change. I mean, the people that take their place can see what's going to happen. And this happened in Texas back in the early 70s with the Sharpstown scandal. And there were a lot of new Texas legislators that came in, and they passed a lot of liberal open records and open meetings laws. But we're sort of back to business as usual now. I mean, it didn't last very long. And you have to be vigilant about it. I mean, maybe term limitation is one of the answers.
Pete Brewton, if the Congress had the will, could our government recover any of this money that you're talking about? Can any of the money be returned to the U.S. people?
Yes, I think so. Particularly anyone who's been convicted, any money they got we can go after that. The Justice Department should and get it back. The question is, what about all the money, like the money paid to St. Joe Paper Company? What about the money to Adnan Khashoggi? What about the money to Walter Mischer's banks? Can we get any of that back? I think if you would have to prove fraud, if you could prove fraud, prove that the money was fraudulently conveyed, then you could get it back. And that's the main hurdle, proving fraud. Once you do that, then yes, you can get the money back.
So it is possible.
Yes, and it's possible to track it. I mean, the Justice Department has said many times, we can't track the money, it's too hard, it's too complicated, it goes offshore, goes to the Caymans, the Isle of Jersey, Switzerland, but that's not true. They can track it. All it takes is a will. They proved they could track it in a drug operation called Operation Polar Cap, where they tracked cash money from the United States going to the Medellin cartel, going down to Panama, and then coming back to the United States. And that's much harder to track than S&L money, where it's all in a paper or computer transactions.
So it all had to do with their will.
Yes.
They wanted to get Noriega in that case. In this case, what happened to Neil Bush when he was actually found guilty of illegal activity? What kind of financial burden did he suffer?
Well, they settled a case where he was accused of, violating the rules and regulations, and he got slapped on the wrist, promised not to do it again.
I wanted to ask you, recently, Michael Wise, the president of Silverado, was in fact indicted on felony charges. Neil Bush hasn't at all been mentioned in relation to that case. Would you suppose he might be liable, that they might be investigating him?
They should be investigating him. I mean, Michael Wise is the first indictment we've had out of Silverado after all these years, the first one. And, Neil Bush should be a target of a grand jury investigation as to what he approved, why he approved it, how he benefited. Those are all questions that a federal grand jury should be extremely interested in knowing.
I have to ask you, you're not very inclined to liking lawyers. You've been abused in your work at the Houston Post. You're in law school now. Why?
Yes. I'm into abuse. No, seriously. I found I needed it for my job. It was another stone wall to doing my job. Not knowing the law, not being able to argue with lawyers was a stone wall in my job, and I needed to be able to do that to do my job well. And that's one of the reasons I'm here.
So are you going to go back to journalism?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any offers at the moment?
No, but I'm not looking for them. I mean, I want to write another book.